Welcome to Midnight Histories. If you enjoy our stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unforgettable tales. Part 1. The Accusations begin. In the bitter winter of 1692, in a small, isolated village in colonial Massachusetts, the air was thick with fear. It was a fear that seeped into every home, every conversation, and every moment of daily life. The harshness of the season mirrored the cold, calculating paranoia that was about to consume the lives of many. The Salem Witch Trials were about to begin, and it would be a time of unspeakable horror for the innocent. It started quietly. A few young girls in Salem Village began to exhibit strange symptoms. They screamed, contorted their bodies in unnatural ways, and had wild fits that no one could explain. The townspeople, deeply religious and steeped in superstition, quickly jumped to a conclusion that would change the course of history. The girls must have been possessed by evil spirits, or worse, they had been cursed by witches. And so, the whispers began. The fear spread like wildfire. The accusations were swift and ruthless. It wasn't long before the young girls named names. Women who had long been on the fringes of society. Women who were different. Women who were often at odds with the strict religious doctrines of Puritan New England. These were the first targets. Women who dared to live outside the narrow confines of what was deemed acceptable. But these women weren't just accused. They were persecuted. The accusations alone were enough to mark them as guilty in the eyes of the villagers. The accusations of witchcraft were so powerful that the accused women were no longer seen as humans, but as the embodiment of evil itself. They became symbols of everything the community feared. As the accusations snowballed, a sickening and systematic pattern emerged. It was a world where guilt was assumed from the moment someone was accused. There was no room for defense, no chance for an innocent person to speak. The mere act of being named as a witch was often enough to seal one's fate. Once the accusations were made, the women were dragged from their homes, shackled, and thrown into the dank, dark cells of Salem's jail. Here, they were left to wait in agonizing uncertainty, knowing that their fate was no longer in their hands. The women who found themselves accused were often socially marginalized in one way or another. Some were poor, others elderly or outspoken. Some had simple disagreements with neighbors, or had been the subject of rumors or envy. One woman, Sarah Good, was a beggar who lived on the outskirts of town. She had long been despised for her poverty and the way she sought help from others. Her fate was sealed when she was accused of causing a child to fall ill with her curses. She was arrested, despite having no chance to defend herself. The horrific reality was that these women were not just accused, they were tortured. The first step in their persecution was a notorious swimming test. They were stripped of their clothes, bound by ropes, and thrown into the cold waters of the nearby lake. The test was simple. If the woman floated, she was considered a witch, for it was believed that water would reject the body of a witch. If she sank, she was deemed innocent, but that came at the cost of death by drowning. It was a lose-lose situation for anyone unfortunate enough to be accused. But the horrors of the Salem Witch Trials did not end with the swimming test. The next form of torture was the infamous witch's chair, a cruel device used to extract confessions. The chair was designed to cause excruciating pain, with sharp iron spikes positioned in such a way that they would dig into the accused's body when she was forced to sit. The idea was to break the will of the accused, to force her into a confession through agony. Many women, desperate to end the torture, falsely confessed to being witches, hoping to bring an end to their suffering. What made it even worse was the societal hysteria that had begun to grip the entire town. Witchcraft was seen as the ultimate form of sin, and the women who were accused were no longer viewed as human beings, but as symbols of the devil's work. The fear of witches had so overwhelmed the town that there was a collective desire to find them, to root them out, even at the cost of innocent lives. Neighbors, once close friends, now stood on opposite sides, with accusations flying like arrows between them. The social fabric of Salem began to disintegrate. Children were pitted against their parents, and spouses turned on one another. The trials were not just about witchcraft. It was a breakdown of the entire community, as fear and suspicion tore through Salem like wildfire. The Salem Witch Trials had only just begun, but the first part of the tragedy was already clear. The accused were suffering unimaginable torment, and no one was safe. It was a nightmare of paranoia, torture, and bloodshed, where guilt was assumed and innocence was irrelevant. The women who were dragged from their homes were soon to become martyrs for a cause that had nothing to do with justice, and everything to do with fear. Part 2. The fear and paranoia spread. As winter turned to spring in 1692, the fear in Salem did not abate. It only grew stronger. What began as a few isolated incidents quickly spiraled into a frenzy of accusations and paranoia. The town was on the edge of hysteria. The witch trials were not just an event. They became a way of life, a twisted ritual that seemed to consume every waking moment of the villagers. Every time someone fell ill, every time a misfortune befell the town, the blame was swiftly placed on those who had already been accused. In a world ruled by superstition, nothing could be explained by reason, only by a belief in unseen forces. The fear of witches grew so deeply ingrained in the community that it blurred the line between reality and fantasy. People were willing to believe that witches were everywhere, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Accusations spread like wildfire, often fueled by personal grudges or old rivalries. It became easier to destroy someone's life by simply pointing a finger and claiming that they had made a pact with the devil. Neighbors who had once shared meals together now turned against each other, fueled by the belief that anyone could be a witch. The very fabric of the community began to unravel. One of the most notorious cases was that of Tituba, an enslaved woman of Caribbean descent, who was among the first to be accused of witchcraft. Tituba was believed to be a practitioner of dark magic, and her confession, obtained through brutal interrogation, set off a chain of events that would lead to dozens of innocent people being accused. Under duress, Tituba confessed to having made a pact with the devil, naming others in her confession to save herself from further torture. Her accusation started a wave of hysteria that would not stop until it claimed the lives of many. As the trials gained momentum, the lawmen and judges, instead of putting a stop to the chaos, fanned the flames. They sought out more suspects, believing that their job was to root out every witch in Salem. The law turned a blind eye to reason and instead placed their trust in the volatile emotional responses of the townspeople, many of whom had no real evidence to offer other than hearsay and suspicion. The accusations reached fever pitch. Soon, even the most respected members of society were not immune. Rebecca Nurse, a woman in her 70s who had been a pillar of the community, was accused of witchcraft. Her trial was a grim spectacle. Her family, desperate to defend her, stood by her side, but the overwhelming paranoia was too much to overcome. Despite her lifelong service to the community, Rebecca Nurse was convicted of witchcraft and sentenced to death. These accusations were not limited to just a few individuals. Whole families found themselves torn apart. Fathers accused their daughters, mothers accused their sons. The very idea of a family became meaningless in a time where betrayal and fear replaced love and trust. Salem had become a crucible for the disintegration of human relationships. Part 3. The torture and trials begin. As the trials continued to unfold, the methods of torture became more brutal. The fear of witchcraft was so all-encompassing that the boundaries of humanity were forgotten. What began as suspicion soon turned into sadistic acts designed to extract confessions. Confessions that were often false, but that brought an end to the torment of those accused. The most infamous form of torture was oppressing, a brutal method that left its victims broken and bloody. The accused were stripped of their clothes and laid on the ground. A heavy board was placed on top of them, and large stones were piled on top until the victim could no longer breathe. The pressure would continue until the person either confessed or died. Giles Corey, an elderly man, was one of the few to refuse to answer the accusations. Instead of confessing, he chose to endure the press. The townspeople would never forget the haunting sound of his last words. More weight. This relentless and cruel tactic broke the will of many accused individuals, forcing them to confess to crimes they did not commit. A confession under such duress was the only escape from the pain. Yet those confessions were the very evidence that led to more convictions and executions. Along with the pressing, the use of dunking was also employed. A person accused of witchcraft would be tied to a chair and thrown into a body of water. The belief was that if the accused floated, they were a witch. If they sank, they were innocent, though drowning was often the inevitable outcome. This was the ultimate paradox. The accused had no chance. They were damned either way. Even more horrific were the public trials. These were not just judicial proceedings, but spectacles of human suffering, where the accused were paraded in front of a crowd, forced to endure questioning by the clergy, and were often publicly humiliated. The townspeople were encouraged to join in the process, pointing fingers and adding to the chorus of voices accusing their neighbors. The trials were designed not for justice, but for spectacle. It was a game of survival, a twisted performance where the accused were expected to confess or die. Many did not survive the grueling interrogations. Even those who did confess were not spared. The confessions were often used to implicate others, ensuring that the witch hunt would continue to feed on the paranoia that had already consumed Salem. The women who were accused were often forced into a corner, with no way to escape the torment. They were treated like animals, not allowed the basic dignity of a fair trial. Every step was designed to break their spirit, to strip away any shred of humanity. In the midst of this chaos, Salem itself was tearing apart, as the witch hunts led to the destruction of families, reputations, and the very trust that held the community together. Part 4, the public execution and the end of hope. As the Salem Witch Trials reached their gruesome climax, the most harrowing chapter of the hysteria began, the public executions. These executions, performed in full view of the villagers, became a grim spectacle where innocent lives were taken with chilling indifference, all in the name of purging the community from the taint of witchcraft. The hangings were swift, merciless, and often gruesome. The accused, stripped of their dignity and dragged to the gallows, were subjected to the cruelest form of punishment. For many, it was the last thing they would experience, the public shaming, the rush of onlookers, the anticipation of death. They were pushed to the edge of the scaffold, their hands bound, their faces filled with terror. As the ropes tightened around their necks and the trapdoor opened beneath them, life slipped away in an instant. Their final moments were drowned in the chaotic noise of the crowd, in the screams of bystanders who believed they were witnessing the cleansing of evil from their midst. The gallows stood as the ultimate symbol of Salem's descent into madness. The executions were not private affairs. They were public events, a twisted form of entertainment for the villagers who gathered to watch. Women and men who had once lived in peace were now condemned to die in the eyes of the town. Those who had no part in the trials, children, the elderly, and the weak, were forced to witness the spectacle. The executions, filled with suffering and terror, became a grim reminder of the fear that had taken over Salem. One of the most tragic executions was that of Rebecca Nurse, an elderly and respected woman in Salem. Rebecca had been a mother, a grandmother, and a devout member of the community. Yet, when accusations of witchcraft were leveled against her, she found herself caught in the web of lies and paranoia. Despite the fact that her character and actions were above reproach, Rebecca was found guilty by the court, and on July 19, 1692, she was hanged. The town had once seen her as a matriarch, but in the end, she was treated like any other accused, which her life extinguished in a horrifying public display. Rebecca's case was emblematic of the widespread disregard for truth. There was no defense. No one questioned the validity of the accusations. The trials had become a stage where fear outweighed reason, and the innocent were made to pay the price for the town's collective paranoia. Families who had loved and known these women and men for years now stood silent in the face of a system gone mad. A community that once thrived on unity and faith was now torn apart by accusations and executions. In many cases, the victims were not even given the dignity of a swift death. The pressing method of execution, used on the elderly and the physically frail, became an infamous part of Salem's history. Giles Corey, a respected farmer in his 80s, refused to plead guilty or innocent, knowing that the court was beyond reason. He was subjected to the torturous pressing, where heavy stones were placed on his chest until his body was crushed beneath the weight. His final words, gasped through the agony, were a defiant plea: more weight. The torture and ultimate death of Giles Corey left an indelible mark on the collective conscience of the town. His silent protest against the hysteria represented the ultimate defiance in a trial system that had abandoned fairness. The executions took a heavy toll on the families of the accused. Many children were left orphaned, their parents condemned to death under the shadow of the witch hunt. The grief and trauma these children endured would linger for the rest of their lives. In a town once bound by the close-knit ties of family and faith, these ties were severed, leaving behind broken homes, fractured relationships, and unanswered questions. But it wasn't just the condemned and their families who suffered. The broader social fabric of Salem had been irreparably damaged. The executions, along with the torture and humiliation of the accused, had become a catalyst for division and distrust. The very nature of the community had shifted. The fear of witchcraft had replaced trust, and suspicion had taken root where once there had been camaraderie. Salem's leaders, particularly Judge Samuel Sewell and Reverend Cotton Mather, had encouraged the executions, believing they were doing God's work. But as the bodies piled up and the community's spirit withered, even they began to see the horrific toll that their decisions had wrought. The sense of guilt and regret began to settle over the men who had been instrumental in these deaths. Sewell would later publicly apologize for his role in the trials, but the lives lost, the families shattered, and the fear instilled in the community could not be undone by mere words. The public executions marked the turning point in the trials. The horror of seeing friends, neighbors, and family members hanging from the gallows or being crushed under the weight of accusations finally shook the townspeople into awareness. The witch trials, which had begun with fervor and certainty, were now unraveling. The public executions, designed to reinforce the trial's legitimacy, instead exposed the underlying injustice and chaos that had consumed Salem. The executions were meant to cleanse Salem, but instead, they further poisoned the town. As the trials wore on, doubt began to creep in. People started to question the validity of the accusations, the integrity of the court, and the legitimacy of the trials themselves. The bloodshed could not be ignored, and soon, even the staunchest defenders of the trials began to waver. The momentum behind the witch hunt, driven by hysteria, was finally beginning to slow. But for those who had already been condemned, the damage was irreversible. Their names were forever stained, their fates sealed in the harshest ways. The public executions were the final chapter of a nightmare that had lasted for months, a chapter that would haunt the town of Salem for centuries to come. Part 5. The Lingering Shadows of Accusations. As the brutal summer of 1692 wore on, the chilling effects of the Salem Witch Trials began to resonate far beyond the gallows. The flames of hysteria that consumed the town were now like an inescapable fire, spreading to every corner of Salem and leaving devastation in its wake. It was no longer enough to simply accuse someone of witchcraft. Every word, every glance, every minor offense could now be twisted into proof of guilt. The community, once bound together by shared faith and a sense of unity, was now engulfed in suspicion and paranoia. The witch hunts had become more than just trials. They were a social contagion, and no one was immune. As accusations piled up, the fabric of Salem society unraveled. People turned against each other, friends and neighbors becoming enemies in a matter of days. Old grievances, petty quarrels, and long-standing rivalries came to the surface, as accusations of witchcraft were weaponized to settle personal scores. The previously tight-knit community had become a place where trust was a commodity no one could afford. Everyone had something to fear. Anyone could be a witch, and anyone could be accused. For the accused, the pain of the trials was not just in the torture and the eventual executions. It was in the relentless fear of being branded as evil. It was in a way they were forced to live, knowing that their every action was now suspect. In a town so gripped by superstition, the mere accusation was enough to destroy someone's life. Women who had lived quiet, peaceful lives were now seen through a lens of suspicion. It didn't matter if they were elderly, poor, or outspoken. If someone had an axe to grind or a grudge to settle, all it took was a whispered word, and their lives were ruined. One of the most tragic aspects of the Salem Witch Trials was how they preyed upon the weakest and most vulnerable members of society. Sarah Good, a poor, homeless woman, was one of the first to be accused. Sarah had long been a source of scorn in the town, known for her begging and her inability to conform to the expectations of society. She was an easy target for those looking to exploit the hysteria. When she was accused of witchcraft, she found herself in a nightmarish situation, tortured into a confession she never made, and then forced to implicate others in a desperate attempt to save herself. The townspeople's desire to purge Salem of witchcraft was driven by a deep and irrational fear that spread to the community like a virus. To accuse someone of witchcraft was to take part in hysteria, to be part of something larger than oneself. The very act of being accused, even without any real evidence, stripped away all humanity. Those who were accused were no longer seen as people. They became symbols of evil, their names forever tarnished by the false claims of the fearful and the vengeful. As the trials progressed, more and more people were dragged into the web of accusations. Even those who had once been trusted members of the community were not safe. John Proctor, a well-respected farmer, was one of the most poignant victims of this madness. His refusal to confess to a crime he did not commit made him a symbol of resistance against the hysteria. He stood firm in the face of accusations, even when faced with execution. His final words, as he was led to gallows, were filled with defiance. He was a man who died for his honor, for his refusal to bend to the madness around him. The trials, once driven by a handful of accusations, now took on a life of their own. The community's desperation to find witches spiraled out of control. It wasn't enough for the accusers to simply find a few witches. The people of Salem now demanded that the guilty be found, no matter the cost. Evidence became irrelevant, as more and more innocents were swept up in the trials. One of the most disturbing aspects of the trials was the way that the so-called evidence was manipulated. Spectral evidence, in which the accuser claimed to see the spirit of the accused attacking them, became the main form of proof. This form of evidence was utterly unreliable, yet it was used to condemn dozens of innocent people to death. No defense could stand against such a vague and fantastical form of accusation. As the executions continued, the town began to feel the weight of what was happening. The executions were no longer just public events. They became a moment of reflection for the townspeople, who had begun to question the legitimacy of the trials. Even those who had initially supported the witch hunts now found themselves grappling with doubt. But for many it was too late. The bodies of the condemned lay in graves, the damage done, and the innocence of the victims forever stained by the hysteria. The fear in Salem reached its apex, and it wasn't just the accused who suffered. The entire town was left in ruins, both socially and psychologically. Families who had lost loved ones were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. They had not only lost family members, but their trust in each other, as the fear of witchcraft had torn apart the very foundation of their community. The emotional trauma left behind by the trials would linger for generations. The survivors lived with the weight of guilt, with the knowledge that they had, in many cases, participated in the destruction of their fellow townspeople. Salem, once a thriving Puritan settlement, was now a place defined by its collective shame. The witch trials had transformed it into a symbol of the dangers of mass hysteria. The fear that had once driven the accusations had now left behind a community that could not look back at its past without discomfort and regret. Part 6. The Climax of Terror. A town divided. By the fall of 1692, the witch trials in Salem had reached a terrifying fever pitch. What began as an isolated incident had spiraled into a full-blown catastrophe, consuming the entire community and threatening to destroy everything in its path. The very fabric of Salem was now unraveling, and it seemed that no one, no matter their age, status, or reputation, was safe from the looming specter of suspicion. The fear that had initially driven the trials was now compounded by a deep sense of uncertainty. The town had been so consumed by the belief that witches were lurking in every shadow, waiting to strike, that it seemed everyone was a suspect. Neighbors who once shared meals together were now accusing each other of witchcraft. The accusations became arbitrary, fueled by personal grudges, jealousy, or simply the need to deflect attention from one's own faults. The witch hunts had grown so widespread that even the most prominent and respected members of the community were caught in the web of paranoia. Elizabeth Proctor, the wife of John Proctor, found herself accused of witchcraft despite her long-standing reputation as a devout and loyal woman. Her charge was as baseless as many others, yet was part of the larger momentum of fear and hysteria that had gripped Salem. The Proctors, once a respected family, had now become symbols of the devastating consequences of society bent on finding evil in every corner. As the accusations continued to mount, a chilling realization began to set in among the townspeople. What was happening in Salem was no longer about finding justice. The trials had become an uncontrollable force, a monster of its own creation, tearing through the community with no mercy or sense of restraint. Once innocent people were now condemned based on nothing more than a fleeting accusation or an overheard whisper. Every interaction, every moment, became a potential opportunity for suspicion to take root. At the same time, the people of Salem began to sense that the very foundations of their society were eroding. The courtrooms, once revered as places of justice, had become theaters of cruelty. The trials were no longer about discovering the truth, but about maintaining the momentum of fear. The evidence presented was often absurd. Spectral evidence, where accusers claimed to see the spirits of the accused attacking them, was used as a primary basis for conviction. These visions were utterly unverifiable, yet they were enough to seal a person's fate. The absence of any real proof didn't seem to matter. What mattered was a hysteria that had taken hold of the town, and no one dared speak out for fear of being accused themselves. The turning point came when even those who had been ardent supporters of the trials began to question what they had unleashed. Reverend Cotton Mather, one of the most fervent proponents of the witch hunt, began to show signs of doubt. The clergy, who had once condemned the accused with righteous certainty, were now faced with the realization that they had been complicit in an atrocity. Judge Samuel Sewell, who had presided over many of the trials, also began to feel the weight of guilt. But these moments of doubt came too late for the many lives already destroyed. The damage was irreparable. In the midst of this growing disillusionment, Governor William Phipps, who had initially supported the trials, intervened. The tipping point came when his wife, Lady Phipps, who had been personally affected by the hysteria, voiced her concerns about the legitimacy of the trials. The governor, shaken by the mounting chaos and the growing outcry from both inside and outside of Salem, decided to halt the proceedings. He disbanded the court and put an end to the trials. But by then, the witch hunts had already left an indelible mark on Salem. The community could never return to the way it was. The trials had torn apart. Families had been broken. Friendships had been shattered. And an atmosphere of distrust and fear had replaced the one solid sense of unity. The innocent were dead, their reputations destroyed, their names forever tied to the dark hysteria of Salem. For those who had been accused and survived, the trauma was deep. Many were left to rebuild their lives. But how could they rebuild trust in a community that had betrayed them so completely? The scars of the witch trials ran deep. The emotional toll on those who had been accused of witchcraft was immense. They had been publicly humiliated, tortured, and in some cases, executed for crimes they never committed. The trauma of these experiences would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In the aftermath, the town's once unified spirit was irreparably fractured. While there were efforts to seek justice for the victims, compensation was later awarded to the families of the executed. The damage to Salem's moral and social fabric was undeniable. The witch trials, in all their horrifying cruelty, had shown the worst side of human nature. The dangers of unchecked fear, the fragility of justice in times of panic, and the destructive power of mass hysteria. The witch trials did not simply end with the disbanding of the court. They left a legacy that continued to resonate throughout the generations. For years, Salem struggled to reconcile its role in one of the darkest chapters of American history. The fear that once united the townspeople now served as a warning for future generations. The trials became a cautionary tale, an example of what can happen when fear, paranoia, and superstition take hold, and when reason is abandoned in favor of hysteria. Part 7. The Downfall, the End of the Trials. The Salem Witch Trials, which had once seemed unstoppable, finally came to a halt in late 1692, but by then, the damage had already been done. The community of Salem was shattered, its people divided, and its moral compass forever tainted. The trials had claimed the lives of 20 innocent people, and countless others have been ruined, either by imprisonment or the irreversible trauma of the events that unfolded in those dark months. For the town of Salem, there was no return to normalcy, only the difficult, painful process of reckoning with the horror that unfolded. It began with a growing wave of doubt. Governor William Phipps, who had initially endorsed the witch trials, was confronted by mounting pressure from his wife and advisors. His wife, Lady Mary Phipps, had witnessed the trials firsthand, and her increasing disillusionment with the proceedings became a catalyst for change. She saw the innocent being condemned without evidence, and the judicial process spiraling out of control. Her pleas were not ignored. By the fall of 1692, Phipps could no longer ignore the mounting chaos and public outcry. The turning point came when Governor Phipps intervened, taking action to halt the trials. His decision was momentous, marking the beginning of the end of Salem's descent into madness. He disbanded the special court that had been established to prosecute the witch trials and called for a more rational approach to justice. This was a decision born out of the growing awareness that the trials had become an exercise in fear-driven chaos and not justice. Even the judges, who had been so eager to convict and condemn, were now questioning the legitimacy of the evidence they had used to destroy lives. The trials, built on hysteria and superstition, were now exposed to what they were, an uncontrollable force fueled by paranoia and bloodlust. But for the victims and their families, the damage was irreparable. The many innocent lives lost, whether by hanging, pressing, or other brutal methods, could not be undone. The families of the condemned had no chance to reclaim their loved ones. The town had become a place where those who had once been cherished members of the community were now ghosts, their reputations destroyed, their fates sealed by a system gone awry. The fear and hysteria that had brought Salem to the brink of destruction had left an indelible scar on its collective psyche. Some of the prominent figures who had driven the trials would later come to regret their actions, but it was too little, too late. Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the most influential judges in the trials, was among the first to publicly acknowledge the deep wrongs that had been committed. In 1697, Sewall issued a public apology for his role in the trials, expressing regret for the lives that had been lost and the destruction that had occurred under his watch. His apology was one of the first public acknowledgments of the gross injustices of the witch hunts, but it was not enough to undo the damage done. Despite the apology, the emotional scars ran deep for the families who had lost loved ones. The survivors of the trials, those who had been accused but ultimately freed, were left to pick up the pieces of their lives. How could they ever return to a community so irrevocably fractured? The emotional toll of being accused, imprisoned, and in some cases tortured was immense. The people of Salem who had survived the witch hunts were marked by the trauma they had endured. Their suffering was not just physical, it was psychological and spiritual, a deep wound that would never fully heal. In the years that followed, Salem tried to rebuild, but the wounds left by the trials were slow to close. The community, once bound together by religious faith and a shared sense of purpose, now found itself divided, mistrusting one another. The bonds of friendship and kinship have been strained to their breaking point. Families have been torn apart, not just by the trials themselves, but by the cruelty and injustice that have been carried out in the name of righteousness. It was difficult, if not impossible, to return to the way things had been. The trials also left behind a legacy that reached far beyond Salem. The witch hunts became an example of the dangers of mass hysteria, the dangers of society driven by fear, and the dangers of a legal system that allowed superstition and paranoia to guide its judgments. The Salem Witch Trials were not the first witch hunt in history, nor would they be the last. They would become a warning for future generations about the consequences of fear-driven justice and the importance of safeguarding reason, compassion, and fairness in the face of social upheaval. The trials also had a significant impact on the development of the American legal system. In the wake of the trials, legal reforms were introduced to ensure that similar miscarriages of justice would not happen again. The Salem Witch Trials became an enduring symbol of the dangers of allowing irrational fear to dictate legal proceedings and the necessity of a fair and balanced justice system, one based on evidence and reason, rather than superstition and emotional frenzy. Even though the witch trials were officially over, their legacy lived on, haunting not just the people of Salem, but the broader American consciousness. The idea that entire communities could be swept up in paranoia and madness, and that innocent people could be destroyed by fear, remain a powerful cautionary tale for centuries to come. Part 8. The cultural and societal impact of the witch trials. The Salem Witch Trials cast a long and disturbing shadow over the history of colonial America, leaving more than just a legacy of lost lives. The echoes of the trials reverberated through Salem, New England, and even beyond, shaping future generations' understanding of justice, fear, and human nature. In the immediate aftermath, the people of Salem were left to confront the chilling reality of what had occurred. The town had been transformed from a close-knit Puritan community into a place marked by shame, regret, and disillusionment. While the trials have been justified by the belief that they were necessary to protect the community from the influence of the devil, those who survived were left with a painful sense of collective guilt. The trials revealed the fragility of justice when placed in the hands of those who allowed superstition and fear to rule over reason. Many of the accused have been subjected to horrific treatment based on little more than rumors, personal grudges, or the desperate confessions of the truly frightened. For the survivors, the trials became a reminder that fear could override logic, leading to the innocent being sacrificed in the name of protection from an unseen enemy. In the years that followed, there was an attempt to reconcile Salem's legacy. In 1702, the trials were officially declared unlawful, and the Massachusetts government passed a bill in 1711 offering compensation to the families of the victims. However, no amount of compensation could undo the horrors of the trials. The people who had lost family members or been subjected to torture could never fully recover from the trauma of those dark months. The witch hunts left scars on both the individual and the community level. Salem's attempt at healing was marred by a sense of guilt that lingered for years. Many of the prominent figures involved in the trials, such as Judge Samuel Sewall, publicly expressed their regret. In 1697, Sewall even issued a public apology for his role in the trials. Yet, the damage done to the town's reputation was irreversible. The town was forever associated with one of the most shameful episodes in American history. Over time, the Salem Witch Trials came to symbolize the dangers of mass hysteria. They became a cautionary tale, highlighting the vulnerability of a society gripped by fear. The trials served as a stark reminder that when fear and superstition take precedence over justice and reason, the consequences can be catastrophic. The people of Salem became symbols of how easily a community could be manipulated by paranoia, how one whisper could unravel the fabric of society. The impact of the trials extended beyond Salem itself. They became part of the larger narrative of American history, often cited as a powerful example of the dangers of witch hunts, not just in colonial America, but across the globe. The fear and distrust that fueled the trials would echo in future events, including the McCarthy trials of the 1950s, when fear of communism led to the persecution of innocent Americans. The witch trials were also studied in later decades as part of broader discussions on justice, the abuse of power, and the consequences of scapegoating vulnerable groups in society. Even centuries after the trials, Salem continued to carry the weight of its dark past. In modern times, Salem has become a place of both reflection and tourism. The town, which was once a symbol of fear and injustice, now attracts thousands of visitors each year. The trials are remembered through museums, monuments, and educational programs that aim to teach about the dangers of mob mentality, social division, and the ways in which unchecked power can lead to cruelty. Despite these efforts to educate and atone for the past, Salem's legacy is still difficult for many to bear. The town will forever be remembered as a place where a community lost its way and allowed paranoia to destroy lives. In a strange way, the Salem Witch Trials continue to serve as a mirror to contemporary societies, reminding us of the importance of remaining vigilant against the dangers of fear-driven judgment and the critical need for justice based on reason, not superstition. Part 9. The Cultural and Historical Legacy. The Salem Witch Trials were over, but their legacy stretched far beyond the town's borders and continue to reverberate throughout American history. The trials were a watershed moment, not just in Salem, but in the broader historical and cultural context, serving as a grim reminder of how mass hysteria can take hold of entire communities and lead to disastrous consequences. While the witch hunts themselves were a product of their time, the lessons learned from them would echo through the centuries. In the years immediately following the trials, Salem did attempt to rebuild, but the emotional scars left by the events of 1692 were deep and lasting. The town could never fully recover from the bloodshed and betrayal that had torn through its streets. The specter of the trials lingered over Salem for generations. Many families who had lost loved ones in the trials found it difficult, if not impossible, to move on. The pain of losing family members to an unjust death, combined with the public shaming that had accompanied the trials, made healing nearly impossible. But the consequences were not limited to the personal losses suffered by the people of Salem. The trials left a lasting mark on the community's psyche and the American consciousness at large. The witch hunts revealed how quickly fear and suspicion could tear apart communities, how easily people could be manipulated by fear into believing in imaginary threats, and how injustice could thrive in an environment of hysteria. Salem's descent into madness served as a chilling example of what can happen when reason is abandoned and fear takes hold. As the years passed, the Salem Witch Trials became a symbol of the dangers of mass paranoia. They were a glaring reminder of how easily people could be swayed by fear and how innocent lives could be destroyed by irrational accusations. The trials would become a cautionary tale, repeated throughout history to remind future generations of the importance of protecting the rights of individuals and safeguarding justice from fear-driven mobs. By the early 18th century, the trials began to be seen through a more critical lens. The public outcry against the trials was growing, and in 1702, the Massachusetts General Court declared the trials unlawful. A decade later, in 1711, the state passed a bill that offered financial compensation to the families of the accused who had been wrongfully executed. While this was an important step, it did little to erase the emotional and social damage inflicted on the people of Salem. The weight of the trial's legacy was too heavy to be lifted by simple restitution. At the same time, the trials began to influence the legal and social structure of New England and the broader American colonies. The failure of the Salem Witch Trials prompted significant reforms in the legal system, especially with regard to the use of spectral evidence in court. Spectral evidence, claims that an accused witch's spirit was causing harm, was ruled inadmissible in future trials. This shift marked a significant move away from the superstition-driven justice of the witch hunts toward a more rational, evidence-based legal system. The lessons learned from Salem would be referenced again and again in future American history. The trials became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of due process, especially during times of social upheaval. The injustice of the Salem Witch Trials would serve as a precedent during the later McCarthy era in the 1950s, when another period of mass paranoia led to a political witch hunt against suspected communists. Just as in Salem, many innocent people were accused, investigated, and ruined based on flimsy evidence and the fear of an invisible enemy. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the Salem Witch Trials would continue to resonate in both academic and popular culture. Writers, historians, and artists would revisit the trials time and again, using the story of Salem as a metaphor for fear-driven persecution. The trials would be depicted in books, plays, and films as a warning about the dangers of scapegoating and mass hysteria. Perhaps the most enduring impact of the trials, however, is the way in which they continue to inform modern discussions of justice and human rights. The Salem Witch Trials serve as a reminder of the fragility of justice in times of fear. The witch hunts revealed how quickly a society can turn on itself when driven by paranoia and superstition. The trials became a cornerstone in the broader conversation about civil liberties and the importance of protecting individuals from unjust persecution. In Salem today, the legacy of the witch trials is one that has both haunted and inspired the town. While Salem has become a center of historical reflection and education, it is also a site of pilgrimage for those interested in the darker aspects of American history. The town now draws thousands of visitors each year, not just to learn about the witch trials, but to engage with the lessons that these dark events continue to impart. Museums, memorials, and educational programs all serve to remind the world of the dangers of collective fear and the power of reasoned, fair justice. The Salem Witch Trials were a tragedy, but they are also a story of survival and resilience. The victims of the trials, both living and dead, continue to be remembered. Their names are now associated with a powerful reminder of the need for vigilance against the forces of ignorance, fear, and injustice. Part 10. The Enduring Legacy, a Modern Reflection. While the Salem Witch Trials ended more than 3 centuries ago, their legacy continues to shape the way we understand fear, justice, and the ways in which societies deal with mass hysteria. The trials serve as a stark warning of what can happen when fear overrides reason and when communities allow paranoia to dictate the fates of individuals. As the trials remain deeply ingrained in American cultural memory, they continue to inspire critical reflection on our legal systems, societal vulnerabilities, and the dangers of witch hunts, both literal and metaphorical. In modern times, the trials have become more than just a historical event. They are a symbol of how societies can spiral into injustice when they succumb to collective fear. The power of the Salem Witch Trials is that they reflect the darkest elements of human nature, our capacity for cruelty, our willingness to sacrifice truth in the name of safety, and our tendency to scapegoat the powerless. These lessons continue to resonate, especially in times of societal upheaval or when fear becomes a driving force in politics or culture. The McCarthy hearings of the 1950s offer a chilling parallel to the witch hunts in Salem. Just as in Salem, accusations were based not on concrete evidence but on fear and suspicion, and many innocent people were ruined based on flimsy, often fabricated claims. During the Red Scare, anyone suspected of being a communist was subjected to public scrutiny, blacklisting, and the destruction of their careers. In both the Salem Witch Trials and the McCarthy era, individuals were guilty by accusation, and the law was manipulated to serve the desires of those in power. This theme of witch hunt reappears throughout history, often in the form of political, social, or cultural persecution. Whether it is the persecution of Jews during the Spanish Inquisition, the treatment of Native Americans during European colonization, or the ongoing oppression of marginalized groups worldwide, the Salem Witch Trials have become a touchstone for understanding the devastating effects of societal fear and the dangers of scapegoating. The idea that society can, at any moment, turn on its most vulnerable members is a critical lesson learned from Salem's dark history. Furthermore, the Salem Witch Trials continue to influence contemporary debates about justice. In the trials, the legal system was not just a passive participant, but an active enabler of injustice. The use of spectral evidence, in particular, highlights the dangers of subjective interpretations of reality, especially when those interpretations are shaped by hysteria, fear, or prejudice. Modern legal scholars continue to reference Salem as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the importance of evidence-based trials, fair treatment, and the necessity of safeguarding the innocent from arbitrary accusations. In recent years, the Salem Witch Trials have also taken on a role in modern feminist discourse. The trials, in many ways, were a manifestation of misogyny and fear of women who did not conform to the rigid expectations of Puritan society. Many of the women accused of witchcraft were those who were seen as other, the marginalized, the independent, the poor, and those who didn't fit into the traditional roles of wife and mother. Feminists have long pointed to Salem as an example of the ways in which women's bodies and lives are controlled, judged, and used as scapegoats in times of societal crisis. The trials remind us of the long history of women suffering at the hands of male-dominated institutions, and the ways in which women's voices and autonomy have often been suppressed. For modern-day Americans, the Salem Witch Trials represent a call for vigilance in the face of rising fears, whether they be fears about the unknown, fears about political or social change, or fears about an external enemy. In moments of crisis, it is often the most vulnerable who are scapegoated, and history has shown that it is all too easy for entire communities to be swept up in collective paranoia. The trials remain a powerful reminder of the need for skepticism and reason in the face of fear, as well as the importance of empathy and the protection of individual rights, especially for those who may be marginalized or unpopular. As Salem has become a focal point for tourists and history buffs alike, it is also a place of reflection, education, and reconciliation. The town now offers a range of historical markers, museums, and exhibits dedicated to the witch trials, where visitors can learn about the victims, the accused, and the lasting impact of the trials on the town's legacy. These educational efforts seek not just to inform, but to foster discussions on the broader lessons of the trials. Lessons about fear, justice, and the need to resist the impulse to target vulnerable individuals in times of uncertainty. The Salem Witch Trials will forever be a part of American history, not only as a dark and tragic chapter, but as an ongoing symbol of how societies can be manipulated by fear and prejudice. The legacy of Salem continues to haunt us, but also calls on us to be better, to protect the rights of the innocent, to question the authority of those who use fear control, and to remember the victims of the past so that we do not repeat their mistakes. As we reflect on the trials, we are reminded of the enduring importance of justice, reason, and compassion in our shared social fabric. The trials may have ended in 1692, but their lessons remain vital to understanding and confronting the prejudices, injustices, and irrational fears that continue to plague societies around the world today. Part 11. The Spark That Ignited the Trials. In the winter of 1691 to 1692, in Salem Village, Massachusetts, a series of seemingly harmless events set the stage for one of the most tragic episodes in American history, the Salem Witch Trials. At the time, Salem was a small Puritan settlement, rooted in strict religious beliefs and surrounded by an ever-present fear of the unknown. The community was already on edge, plagued by internal disputes, tensions between farmers and wealthier merchants, and the constant threat of Native American attacks on the frontier. But nothing would prepare them for the terror that would soon consume them from within. It all started innocuously with a group of young girls, the daughters and nieces of prominent Salem residents, who began to behave erratically. They screamed uncontrollably, contorted their bodies in strange and unnatural ways, and became mute, fitful, and highly agitated. These bizarre symptoms were at first shrugged off as simple illness or the consequences of living in a harsh, unforgiving environment. But as time went on, the girl's condition worsened, and no doctor or healer could offer any rational explanation. It was Betty Paris, the daughter of Reverend Samuel Paris, who was the first to show signs of these strange fits. Betty, who was only about 9 years old, began to convulse, shriek, and stare blankly into space. She seemed to be overcome by something otherworldly, something that could not be explained. Soon, other girls in the village, including Abigail Williams, Betty's cousin, and several others from the local community, began exhibiting similar symptoms. As the girls' fits persisted, whispers of witchcraft started to spread throughout the community. In a Puritan society where the supernatural and divine intervention were constant topics of discussion, it did not take long for people to connect the girls' afflictions with the work of witches. Witches, in the Puritan worldview, were seen as agents of the devil, men and women who had made pacts with Satan to perform malicious acts on others. In a society so entrenched in fear of evil and the unknown, the thought that witches might be among them became a terrifying possibility. As more girls fell ill, and their symptoms became more severe, the town was gripped with panic. The question on everyone's mind was, who was responsible for this? The idea that witchcraft had infiltrated their small, pious village became an increasingly accepted theory. And, as is often the case in times of hysteria, those who were the most vulnerable, women who were already marginalized in society, became the prime suspects. But it was not just any woman who would be accused. Women who were already viewed as outsiders, those who didn't conform to the rigid expectations of Puritan society, became prime targets. Tituba, an enslaved woman from the Caribbean who lived in Reverend Paris's home, was the first to be accused of witchcraft. Tituba had long been a source of fascination for Puritans, who viewed her foreign background and beliefs with suspicion. She was a servant in the Paris household, and her strange, exotic customs made her an easy scapegoat when the accusations began to fly. In the atmosphere of fear and suspicion that had settled over Salem, Tituba's situation became dire. Under pressure from her accusers and the intense scrutiny of her position as a servant, Tituba was coerced into a confession. In a moment that would set the entire witch trial process into motion, she admitted to being a witch and consorting with the devil. Her confession was riddled with fantastical details of Satan's servants, and in her desperation, she named others in the community whom she claimed were also witches. Once Tituba confessed, the floodgates of hysteria were thrown wide open. Her confession was all the proof that the townspeople needed. She named several other women as witches, and these accusations, in turn, led to more confessions, more names, and more accusations. The ripple effect was inevitable. In a community like Salem, where suspicion could be deadly, the mere act of being named as a witch was enough to seal a person's fate. The first women to be accused, along with Tituba, were Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. Sarah Good was a poor, homeless woman who had long been disliked by her neighbors for her begging and her inability to conform to social norms. She was an easy target in a community that valued conformity. Sarah Osborne, on the other hand, was a woman of a higher social class, but she had recently remarried a man who was seen as socially inferior. Her marriage, which was seen as scandalous, made her an outcast in the eyes of the deeply conservative community. These women, along with Tituba, were the first to be charged and accused publicly, but they would not be the last. As the accusations snowballed, the very fabric of Salem began to unravel. Neighbors turned on each other, families were divided, and the once peaceful village descended into madness. Judge Samuel Sewell, Reverend Cotton Mather, and other religious leaders were called upon to guide the proceedings, and their involvement only fueled the chaos. The trials became more than just about finding witches. They became about saving face, about maintaining the fragile authority of the Puritan theocracy. From this point onward, the trials snowballed into a tragic farce. The first confessions, such as Tituba's, were enough to stoke the flames of fear. With every new accusation, more people were implicated, more people confessed. Each confession named more witches, and the cycle of suspicion continued to spiral out of control. The town of Salem, which had once prided itself on its religious purity and order, had now fallen victim to its own worst fears. The very people who had lived side by side in harmony now saw one another as potential threats. No one was safe. The witch hunts, fueled by panic, superstition, and religious fervor, would soon become a tidal wave that swept through Salem, leaving death and devastation in its wake. Part 12, The Accusation Spiral. As winter turned to spring in 1692, the seeds of suspicion that had been sown in the cold months began to grow rapidly, reaching new heights of paranoia and fear. The confessions of Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne were just the beginning. With the powerful religious figures of Salem backing the trials, the accusation of witchcraft became a tool of fear, a weapon that could be wielded against anyone in the community. This created a dangerous environment where people found themselves constantly watching their backs, afraid that even the smallest misstep could lead to an accusation. The initial suspect had been outcast in the eyes of the community, women who were poor, elderly, or socially unconventional. However, as the witch hunts progressed, the scope of the accusations expanded to encompass a far broader group of people. Accusations no longer targeted only the marginalized. Even well-respected individuals were now named as witches. The trials were no longer about finding a few guilty parties. They had become a violent cycle of blame, in which even a whispered accusation could destroy someone's life. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Salem Witch Trials was the role of children in the proceedings. The young girls who had initially exhibited the strange fits, Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, and others, became the key witnesses in the trials. Their testimonies were taken as gospel, and their claims of seeing the spirits of the accused tormenting them were used to condemn others to death. These young girls, many of whom were caught up in the hysteria themselves, began to name more and more people as witches. Their accusations were often vague, based on nothing more than dreams, visions, or the subjective experiences of the accuser. Yet, in a court of law where fear outweighed reason, these testimonies were deemed enough to secure convictions. One of the first to be convicted based on these unreliable testimonies was Sarah Good, the poor beggar. She was accused of causing the illnesses of the young girls and other misfortunes that had befallen the community. Her social status made her an easy target. She was someone whom others in the village could blame for their own misfortunes. Sarah Good was relentlessly questioned, tortured, and coerced into confessing. Faced with the unbearable pressure of being accused of witchcraft, she admitted to being guilty, naming other supposed witches in her confession. In her desperate bid to end the pain of her torture, Sarah implicated others. This marked the start of a disturbing pattern, where confessions under duress were used as evidence, leading to even more people being accused and imprisoned. As the accusation spread, the community became consumed by fear. The once tight-knit society was now divided, with friends, neighbors, and even families accusing each other. Those who had once lived together in harmony now turned against one another, fueled by suspicion and the belief that if one person in a family was accused, the entire family could be guilty. This paranoia escalated as people looked for any reason to suspect witchcraft, and many saw witch trials as a way to settle old scores or gain power. Rebecca Nurse, a well-respected elderly woman in Salem, was one of the first to be accused from the ranks of the respected. Rebecca had been a matriarch of her family, revered for her piety and kindness. Her trial and execution were among the most tragic. Her accusation was based on spectral evidence. She was said to have appeared as a spirit to several of the accusers and tormented them during their fits. Despite her good reputation, Rebecca Nurse was convicted of witchcraft and hanged on July 19, 1692. Her execution shocked many in the community, who had believed that no one as virtuous as Rebecca could ever be guilty. Yet the hysteria that had overtaken Salem was unrelenting, and even the most respected members of the community were not safe. The sense of injustice became palpable as more people were accused and convicted. Entire families were torn apart as accusations spread like wildfire. For those who'd been accused, there was no escaping the public humiliation, the torture, and the fear of death. The women who found themselves at the center of the trials were often forced to confess, not because they were guilty, but because the pressure and torture were too much to endure. They named others in a desperate attempt to save themselves, only for their confessions to lead to more trials and more executions. This is where the infamous spectral evidence came into play, a type of evidence in which the accused were said to appear as spirits to the accusers. Spectral evidence was deeply problematic because it was based entirely on the subjective visions of the accusers. There was no way to prove or disprove it, making it incredibly dangerous. The courts, swayed by the belief in witches and the power of the devil, accepted these visions as valid proof, making it easier for the accusations to snowball. Anyone who had been named could be convicted based on the mere testimony of someone who claimed to have seen their spirit tormenting them. The use of spectral evidence played a key role in fueling the fear that drove the trials to their peak. As the trials continued, more and more people were swept up into madness. The accusers' stories became increasingly elaborate, and the list of names grew longer by the day. It wasn't just about finding a few witches. It was about finding more witches, as if the town's very survival depended on it. The hysteria reached such a point that even respected, God-fearing people were not immune to the accusations. It seemed as though no one could escape the reach of the witch hunts. As the trial spiraled out of control, the town's leadership, particularly Reverend Samuel Parris and Judge Samuel Sewell, became more entrenched in their roles. Parris, the minister whose daughter, Betty, had sparked the initial panic, became a key figure in the trials. His desire to rid Salem of witches seemed to grow with every new accusation. Judge Sewell, who had been appointed to oversee the trials, was unwavering in his belief that the trials were divinely ordained. His involvement in the proceedings sealed his reputation in history, though he would later express regret over his actions. Salem's once rigidly religious society was now caught in a destructive whirlwind of accusations, confessions, and executions. The trials, what had started as an attempt to root out evil, had become a mirror of fear, a distorted reflection of a community that had lost its way. Part 13, The Unraveling of Reason, The Collapse of Justice. As the months passed and the witch trials intensified, the impact on Salem's legal and social systems became devastatingly clear. The town, once a model of religious piety, now found itself at the mercy of hysteria and superstition. What had started as a series of inexplicable fits among a group of young girls had blossomed into a full-scale witch hunt with no end in sight. The justice system, which had once been seen as a stabilizing force in the community, began to fracture under the weight of irrational fear. The courts, presided over by Judge Samuel Sewell, Judge William Stoughton, and others, became increasingly unable to distinguish between fact and fiction. These men, influenced by their own beliefs and the mounting pressure from their community, disregarded basic principles of fairness. Reverend Cotton Mather, a staunch supporter of the trials, also played a key role in reinforcing the belief that witchcraft was an active and present danger that needed to be eradicated by any means necessary. As accusations swirled and the trials raged on, the town's legal framework began to disintegrate. The process of accusing someone of witchcraft became a grotesque parody of justice, with rules and procedures thrown out in favor of panic. Spectral evidence, a type of testimony in which the accuser claimed to have seen the spirit of the accused tormenting them, was allowed as valid proof. It was a form of evidence that had no physical basis and was impossible to verify, yet became one of the most frequently cited forms of proof in the trials. The accusers themselves were often children or young girls whose credibility should have been questioned, yet their visions were treated as divinely inspired truth. Perhaps one of the most egregious elements of these trials was the touch test. This bizarre practice involved the accused which physically touching the afflicted person, often with the hope that the affliction would be cured. If the afflicted person's symptoms suddenly improved or ceased, it was seen as confirmation of the accused's guilt. This was not a method grounded in logic or reason, but rooted in medieval superstitions, and reflected just how far Salem had strayed from rationality. As these trials dragged on, the system of justice in Salem was exposed as deeply flawed. The lack of real evidence, combined with a reliance on spectral visions, meant that anyone could be convicted based on nothing more than accusations and public hysteria. The notion of innocent until proven guilty was abandoned. Instead, the accused were forced to prove their innocence in an environment where reason had no place. One of the most telling examples of the miscarriage of justice during the trials was the case of George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem Village. Burroughs had been accused of witchcraft despite his position as a respected clergyman. His trial was a spectacle of contradictions. He was accused of being the leader of a coven of witches, a claim that was entirely without evidence. His execution on August 19, 1692, became one of the most haunting moments in the entire trial process. Before he was hanged, Burroughs famously recited the Lord's Prayer flawlessly, something that was seen as impossible for a witch to do. His ability to recite the prayer was taken as proof of his innocence, but it came too late. The crowd, whipped into a frenzy of fear and bloodlust, refused to accept this evidence, and Burroughs was executed nonetheless. Another significant factor in the trials was the role of confession. At this stage, confessing to witchcraft became a way for the accused to avoid execution. Women, men, and even children who were accused of witchcraft found themselves in a brutal dilemma. Confess to the crime you did not commit and live, or deny it and face death. Many, including Tituba, who had been the first to confess, opted to admit to witchcraft in order to escape the torturous conditions of imprisonment. However, these forced confessions only fed the hysteria further. Once a person confessed, they were often coerced into naming others, leading to an ever-expanding circle of accusations. One such person was Martha Corey, a woman who had been a pillar of Salem society. Her case showed just how absurd the accusations had become. Martha was accused by a group of teenage girls, but her only crime appeared to be her outspoken skepticism of the trials. She had dared to question the validity of the charges against the accused witches. This was enough to make her a target. Despite being a devout woman who had long followed the teachings of the church, Martha was accused and ultimately hanged, her reputation destroyed by a mere whisper of accusation. She is a tragic example of how even those who spoke out against the witch hunts were pulled into the deadly web of suspicion. The entire process had become self-perpetuating. Each confession, each accusation, led to more trials, more executions, and more people drawn into the cycle of fear. The fear of witchcraft had taken on a life of its own. It was no longer about finding witches. It was about maintaining the momentum of the hunt. As more people were accused and executed, the entire town became caught in a frenzy of belief and accusation. The witch trials not only devastated the lives of the accused, but also left the people of Salem broken. Trust had evaporated. The social fabric of the community was ripped apart, as even those who had once been close allies became adversaries in the witch hunt. Families were torn apart by accusations, with children naming their parents and siblings naming each other. The trials had corrupted every aspect of Salem society, turning neighbors into enemies and creating an atmosphere of constant fear. No one could be trusted, and no one was safe. Part 14. The spread of fear, the town unravels. By the time the Salem Witch Trials had gained momentum, the community of Salem had spiraled into a frenzy of suspicion, accusation, and fear. The initial few accusations had turned into a full-blown witch hunt, with the townspeople turning on one another in a vicious cycle of blame and retribution. As more people were named and imprisoned, the emotional and psychological toll on Salem grew insurmountable. The village that had once prided itself on its piety and unity was now divided, torn apart by the very paranoia that had sparked the trials in the first place. The role of the accusers became increasingly powerful. The girls who had first started the hysteria, Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, and others, now held the power of life and death in their hands. As the number of accused witches grew, so did the confidence of the accusers. They began to name more and more people, some of whom were complete strangers, while others were lifelong friends or respected neighbors. Abigail Williams, in particular, became one of the most prominent figures in the accusations. Her visions of witches attacking her were presented as undeniable proof, even though they were based on nothing but fear and imagination. She had gone from a frightened child to one of the most feared individuals in Salem. What made the situation even more devastating was that the accusers were not just children. They were often young women who had learned the power they wielded to the trial process. They had learned that their words could send people to their deaths. The power of accusation became intoxicating, and the more names they could provide, the more their position in Salem society seemed to grow. These accusers, often teenagers, were given a platform of immense influence, where their visions and accusations were taken as gospel. The children, many of them suffering from inexplicable fits and hallucinations, became the town's primary witnesses in the trials. When they spoke, their voices were believed to hold the ultimate truth, even though the nature of their afflictions was never thoroughly examined. What started as genuine distress, perhaps even driven by psychological stress or illness, quickly turned into a dangerous weapon. They were not just passive victims in this tragedy. They were active participants, their accusations setting off a wave of violence and fear that consumed Salem. The cases of the accused were often devoid of any rational legal process. Those who had been accused were subjected to excruciating methods of questioning and torture. In a desperate bid to avoid execution, many falsely confessed to witchcraft, naming others in the process. These confessions, extracted under duress, fed the cycle, adding fuel to the flames of paranoia. One of the most tragic cases was that of Martha Corey, an elderly and respected woman who had lived in Salem for years without controversy. Martha was accused of witchcraft after her husband, Giles Corey, spoke out publicly against the trials and voiced his skepticism. Her case epitomized the absurdity of the trials. She was a woman who had no history of misdeeds, no strange behavior, and no known enemies. Yet, she was accused by the same girls whose fits had set the trials into motion. Her trial was short and filled with spectacle, with little to no real evidence other than the allegations of those who claimed she was tormenting them with her spirit. Despite her desperate defense and the fact that she had a lifelong reputation as a devout and pious woman, she was found guilty and sentenced to death. In addition to the physical toll the trials took on the accused, the psychological impact was equally devastating. The emotional and social consequences for the accused were beyond what most could endure. Once accused, a person's reputation was tarnished forever, whether they were convicted or not. The fear of being accused was enough to turn friends against each other and even tear families apart. Children testified against parents, husbands against wives, and neighbors against neighbors. In the most tragic instances, entire families were torn apart by accusations and convictions. Even those who survived the trials found themselves haunted by the scars of the events. Many of the accused who were eventually freed, whether they had confessed to witchcraft or not, returned to a community that no longer trusted them. Their reputations were forever damaged, and the emotional toll of the trials will remain with them for the rest of their lives. The hysteria had affected every aspect of life in Salem. The once tight-knit village had become a place of fear, where every stranger was a suspect and every person was a potential traitor. Trust had broken down completely. The fear of witches had become so pervasive that no one was safe. Even the most seemingly trivial incident could be construed as evidence of witchcraft. A poorly baked loaf of bread, a sick cow, or a poorly timed thunderstorm. These could all become proof of witchcraft in a society that had turned against reason and embraced superstition. As more and more names were added to the list of the accused, the community began to realize the full extent of the devastation. But it was too late. The trials had gained momentum, and now there was no turning back. The very process of accusing someone of witchcraft had become its own monster. People no longer sought justice. They sought more witches to satisfy their insatiable fear. The witch hunt, which had started with a handful of accusations, now engulfed the town in a whirlwind of madness. Part 15, The Absurdity of the Trials, a community in chaos. As the trials raged on through the spring and summer of 1692, the situation in Salem grew increasingly absurd. What had begun as a small set of accusations and rumors quickly morphed into a massive, uncontrollable witch hunt, fueled by fear, superstition, and a warped sense of justice. The court, with its judges and clerics, became a warped theater where rationality was suspended, and the most bizarre and unprovable forms of evidence were accepted as fact. The accused, now numbering in the dozens, were subjected to some of the most horrific and nonsensical interrogations in the history of colonies. Many of the accused, knowing that their only chance of survival was to confess, gave into the overwhelming pressure to do so. These confessions were often deeply coerced, extracted through mental and physical torture, and frequently named others who were then accused in turn. This created a vicious cycle. The more people confessed, the more others were dragged into the maelstrom. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of the trials was the use of spectral evidence. Spectral evidence allowed accusers to claim that they had seen the spirits or specters of the accused tormenting them. These visions, entirely based on imagination or psychological suggestion, were treated as legitimate proof of guilt. Spectral evidence turned the very idea of justice on its head. Since it was impossible to prove or disprove the presence of a specter, the accused had no defense against such accusations. It didn't matter if someone had an airtight alibi or was a respected member of the community. The mere fact that someone said they saw the accused spirit attacking them was enough to seal their fate. Take, for example, the case of John Proctor, a well-respected farmer and devout Puritan. He had been accused by several of the afflicted girls, who claimed to have seen his spirit tormenting them. Proctor, a man of strong character, refused to confess to a crime he did not commit. His refusal to admit guilt made him a symbol of defiance in the face of injustice, but it also sealed his fate. Proctor, along with others who resisted confession, was convicted and sentenced to death. In the final moments of his life, he chose to die with honor rather than give in to the manipulative tactics of the trial. His execution became a turning point for many in Salem, as they began to question the validity of the trials and the validity of the evidence being presented. As the number of accused grew, so did the chaos and absurdity of the trials. Reverend Cotton Mather, a staunch supporter of the trials, continued to push for more executions. His belief in the righteousness of the witch hunt blinded him to the growing absurdity of the proceedings. Mather, who had once been a beacon of religious authority in Salem, became a symbol of blind faith. His insistence on persecuting witches without evidence echoed throughout the community, deepening the hysteria and making it impossible for reason to take hold. While Mather and others in power were driving the witch hunts forward, there were cracks starting to appear in the community's belief in the trials. Whispers of doubt began to spread, particularly as the number of accusations increased. The trials were not just affecting poor, marginalized women anymore. They were claiming the lives of people who had once been seen as pillars of the community. Rebecca Nurse, a godly woman who had lived in Salem for decades, was accused and executed. Her trial shocked many who had known her for years and had never suspected her of witchcraft. Rebecca was a matriarch in Salem, well respected for her charitable works and her piety. But in the climate of fear and suspicion, even the most virtuous were not safe. As the number of executions mounted, some members of Salem began to ask themselves, how many witches could there really be in such a small community? The rational doubts were growing louder, but by then, it was nearly impossible to stop the momentum of the trials. The court, despite the growing evidence of its failings, continued to accept spectral evidence and confessions as proof of guilt, creating a feedback loop where accusations snowballed out of control. The trial of Giles Corey, a respected, elderly farmer, marked another tragic chapter. When Corey refused to enter a plea, he was subjected to the infamous pressing, where large stones were piled upon his chest in an attempt to force a confession. Giles Corey's refusal to give in to the pressure of the court made him one of the most heroic figures in the trials. His final words, "more weight," as the stones were placed upon him, had become symbolic of the defiance and tragic fate of many in Salem. Corey's death further illustrated the injustice and absurdity of the witch trials, as a man who refused to acknowledge the court's authority was tortured to death for his silence. As more and more innocent people were condemned, it became clear to some that the witch hunts had become a self-perpetuating cycle. The more accusations there were, the more people confessed or named others. But each confession only further fueled the fire. The town of Salem had descended into madness, with little hope of return to normalcy. Fear, rather than reason, had become the guiding force, and once the hysteria had taken root, it was nearly impossible to stem the tide. The psychological toll of the trials on the community was incalculable. Families who had once been united were now torn apart by accusations. Parents were forced to turn on their children, children on their parents, neighbors on neighbors. The very notion of trust, which had once been the bedrock of the Puritan community, evaporated entirely. The Salem Witch Trials had created a town of strangers, each person suspecting the other, each person wondering who would turn on them next. The trials, once seen as an opportunity to rid Salem of evil, had become a moral quagmire. No one was safe. No one could escape the terror that had overtaken the town. The deepening absurdity of the trials was a painful reminder that in the pursuit of truth, Salem had lost its way. What began as a search for justice had descended into chaos, with no clear path back to rationality. Part 16, The Turning Point, Doubt, and Resistance. By late summer 1692, the momentum of the witch trials had become a dangerous force, sweeping through Salem with ferocity that seemed unstoppable. The trials had already claimed the lives of 20 people, most of them women, and dozens more were languishing in prison, awaiting their fate. But as more and more people were accused, something began to shift in Salem. The growing absurdity of the trials, coupled with mounting doubt and resistance from within the community, created cracks in the foundation of hysteria. The public executions, which had once been viewed as righteous acts to cleanse Salem of evil, now began to draw increasing criticism. Many of the executions were carried out in full public view, with townspeople gathered to watch as their neighbors were led to the gallows or burned at the stake. However, as the number of deaths mounted and more prominent figures became involved, questions began to emerge. One of the first voices of dissent came from Reverend Increase Mather, a respected clergyman and father of Cotton Mather, who had been one of the strongest proponents of the witch trials. Increase Mather had long supported the trials, but as the number of executions grew, he began to see the cracks in the system. His growing unease was in part due to the increasing use of spectral evidence, which was central to many convictions. Spectral evidence, based on accusations of seeing the spirit of the accused tormenting the accuser, was highly unreliable and unprovable. Mather became one of the first public figures to speak out against it. He argued that the court should be more cautious and that the trials were spiraling out of control. Increase Mather's critical stance was a turning point for many in the community. Although he had supported the witch hunts initially, his public doubt and growing discomfort with the proceedings lent credibility to those who were beginning to question the trials. Mather's call for caution, though not immediately successful, marked the beginning of the end for the witch hunts. Another key figure in the eventual cessation of the trials was Governor William Phips. Initially, Phips had supported the trials, even establishing the special court that had convicted so many of Salem's citizens. But as the number of accusations grew, Phips began to hear reports of the increasing injustice. His wife, Mary Phips, who had witnessed the chaos of the trials firsthand, was one of the strongest voices advocating for an end to the witch hunts. She became increasingly concerned about the growing number of innocent people being imprisoned and executed. Phipps's concern grew as well, particularly after the trial of his own wife's close friend, Sarah Cloyes, who had been accused and found guilty of witchcraft. Phips, torn between his public duty and the swelling public outcry, called for a stop to the trials. In October 1692, he officially intervened, halting the trials and disbanding the court that had overseen the proceedings. The special court was replaced by a more traditional court system, and Phips ordered that the remaining trials be reviewed under a more cautious and rational process. In a stunning reversal, the witch trials, once seen as divinely inspired and vital to protecting Salem from evil, were called to an end. While the intervention of Phips and Mather marked the end of the witch hunts, it came too late for many who had already suffered. The damage had been done. The town of Salem was broken, and the lives of the accused and their families were irrevocably changed. Those who had been executed could never be brought back, and the survivors of the trials lived with the trauma of the experience for the rest of their lives. Even after the trials officially ended, many of the accused were never truly exonerated, and the stigma of being associated with the witch hunts remained for generations. The trials also left deep psychological scars on the community. Trust, which had once been a cornerstone of Salem's social fabric, was gone. Neighbors who had once been close friends now viewed each other with suspicion. Families were torn apart by accusations. An emotional toll of the trials was incalculable. The people of Salem had learned a painful lesson about the dangers of mass hysteria and the destructive power of unchecked fear. In the years following the end of the witch trials, there was an attempt to make amends for the mistakes of the past. In 1702, the trials were declared unlawful by the Massachusetts General Court, and a year later, compensation was provided to families of those who had been wrongfully executed. The government and religious leaders in Salem made public apologies, and some individuals, like Judge Samuel Sewall, publicly expressed regret for their actions. In 1697, Sewall became the first to publicly apologize for his role in the trials, acknowledging the irreparable damage caused by his actions and the actions of the court. While these gestures of apology and compensation were important steps toward reconciliation, they could never undo the devastation caused by the witch trials. The community of Salem, once filled with the trust and unity that had characterized it, was left scarred by the trials. The trials had revealed how easily a society could descend into fear-driven violence, and how quickly rational thought could be replaced by superstition and paranoia. The psychological and cultural damage endured for years after the trials. Families who had lost members to the hangings, pressings, and other executions struggled to rebuild their lives. The survivors of the trials, often left in financial ruin and emotional devastation, found it hard to return to a normal life. Many of the townspeople who had participated in the trials, whether through direct involvement or by standing idly by, lived with the burden of knowing that they had been complicit in the destruction of innocent lives. Part 17, The Reckoning. Salem struggled with its dark legacy. When the Salem Witch Trials finally came to an end in the fall of 1692, the people of Salem were left to face the wreckage of what had transpired. In the aftermath of the trials, there was a difficult reckoning, as the community struggled to come to terms with the chaos, fear, and destruction that had consumed them. Those who had survived, both the accused and their families, were left to rebuild their lives in a town that had been torn apart by paranoia and fear. The psychological scars of the trials were deep and enduring, and no amount of apology or compensation could undo the devastation caused. Though the trials had officially ended, the trauma did not disappear overnight. For the accused who had been imprisoned and forced to endure the horrors of torture and public humiliation, returning to normal life seemed impossible. Those who had confessed to witchcraft, either out of desperation or fear, carried the burden of having falsely admitted to a crime they did not commit. Many of them named others in the hopes of saving themselves, but this only perpetuated the cycle of accusations. The survivors of the trial struggled with guilt, shame, and the heavy emotional weight of knowing they had been implicated in a system that destroyed lives. The emotional toll on the families who had lost loved ones was equally profound. Families who had been torn apart by the trials now had to face the painful reality of their loss. The emotional scars left by the executions were not easily healed. Sons, daughters, husbands, and wives who had been accused and executed were now reduced to mere names on gravestones, their lives taken by the judicial system that had been overtaken by fear. The deaths of Sarah Good, John Proctor, Rebecca Nurse, and others could never be undone, and their families were left to grieve in silence, knowing that their loved ones had been sacrificed to a madness that was out of their control. The town of Salem, once unified in its strict religious beliefs, now found itself fractured, its bonds shattered by the trials. Trust, which had been the bedrock of the Puritan society, was gone. Neighbors who had once shared the same pews in church now eyed one another with suspicion. The social fabric had been irreparably damaged, and the paranoia that had gripped the community was not easily eradicated. Even after the trials ended, people found it difficult to rebuild their relationships with one another. The fear that had once driven the accusations now hung over Salem like a cloud, and no one was free from its lingering effects. In the years following the trials, Governor William Phips took several steps to address the damage caused by the witch hunts. In 1702, the trials were officially declared unlawful by the Massachusetts General Court, and a year later, a law was passed to compensate the families of those who had been executed. However, the efforts to make restitution were inadequate, and the damage to the town's social fabric remained. Phips, who had played a key role in the end of the trials, could not undo the harm that had been done. Judge Samuel Sewall, who had presided over many of the trials, publicly apologized for his role in the events, acknowledging the deep wrongs that had been committed. In 1697, Sewall issued a formal apology, stating that he had been deceived by the evidence and expressing regret for the suffering caused by the trials. However, his apology was not universally accepted. Many of the families who had lost loved ones during the trials felt that no apology could undo the damage done. The stigma of being associated with the witch trials would remain for years, and the survivors found themselves haunted by the ghosts of the past. The larger cultural reckoning would take longer. In the early 18th century, the witch trials began to be viewed with increasing skepticism. The use of spectral evidence, the coerced confessions, and the lack of solid evidence all became key points of critique. Historians, religious leaders, and philosophers began to discuss the trials as an example of the dangers of mass hysteria, the dangers of a society governed by superstition, and the dangers of a legal system that could be manipulated by fear. The witch hunts, once seen as a righteous effort to root out evil, became a symbol of injustice. By the 19th century, the trials had become a topic of fascination and reflection. Writers like Nathaniel Hawthorne and Arthur Miller used the trials as a metaphor for broader social and political issues, including the dangers of mob mentality and the persecution of marginalized groups. Miller's play, The Crucible, written in 1953, drew direct parallels between the Salem Witch Trials and the Red Scare of the 1950s, highlighting how fear and paranoia could lead to the persecution of innocent people. The Salem Witch Trials became a powerful reminder of the dangers of hysteria, of the fragility of justice in the face of mass fear, and the ways in which society could turn on itself. The trials became a symbol of how people, in moments of great fear, could be easily manipulated and convinced to commit acts of cruelty in the name of righteousness. The fear-driven nature of the trials made it clear that, without vigilance, reason could be easily replaced by superstition, and justice could be sacrificed for the sake of perceived greater good. Even today, the Salem Witch Trials continue to shape our understanding of social justice, the dangers of scapegoating, and the importance of protecting individuals from the tyranny of mass panic. The trials serve as a chilling example of the ways in which the law can be twisted and abused when fear takes control, and they remind us that the pursuit of justice must always be grounded in reason, fairness, and the protection of human rights. Part 18, The Enduring Lessons, Justice, Fear, and Reflection. As the dust settled after the trials and the witch hunts finally came to an end, the tragedy of the Salem Witch Trials began to serve as a dark yet powerful lesson for generations to come. The emotional toll on the people of Salem was immense, but the historical repercussions were even more profound. The witch trials demonstrated the dangers of fear-driven justice, the ease with which a society can descend into mass hysteria, and the lasting impact of such events on the cultural and legal fabric of community. These lessons would reverberate throughout history, informing future generations' understanding of justice, human rights, and the fragile balance between reason and superstition. The lessons for justice systems. One of the most significant legacies of the Salem Witch Trials was the profound impact they had on the development of American legal thought. The trial proceedings, the use of spectral evidence, and a complete disregard for the rights of the accused laid bare the flaws in the legal system of the time. The trials demonstrated how easily the law could be manipulated by fear and superstition, and how this manipulation could lead to catastrophic consequences for innocent people. In the aftermath, legal scholars, lawmakers, and philosophers began to re-examine the foundations of the justice system. The most glaring flaw in the trials was a reliance on spectral evidence, a form of testimony based on visions of the accused spirit. This type of evidence, while deeply rooted in superstition, had been accepted as legitimate in the courts, and was often the deciding factor in condemning individuals to death. The trials exposed how subjective and unreliable such evidence could be, and the legal system slowly began to move away from it in the years following the trials. The trials highlighted the need for a more evidence-based approach to justice. In the centuries that followed, many legal reforms were made to ensure that trials would be conducted fairly, and that accusations would require solid evidence rather than vague claims or hearsay. The principle that a person is innocent until proven guilty, something that had been tragically ignored in Salem, became enshrined in the foundations of the American legal system. The Salem Witch Trials became a cautionary tale that helped shape the future of criminal justice in the United States and many other nations. The trials also highlighted the importance of due process, the right of the accused to have a fair trial, to present evidence in their defense, and to be judged by a fair and impartial system. The trials of 1692 had deprived the accused of these rights, often condemning them without proper evidence or defense. This fundamental violation of human rights was a catalyst to the development of modern legal protections, including the right to a fair trial, the right against self-incrimination, and the prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment. Fear and hysteria in society. Beyond the legal implications, The Salem Witch Trials continue to serve as a powerful symbol of the dangers of fear-driven societies. The trials demonstrated how easily a community can be swept up by panic, how suspicion can override reason, and how easily social order can collapse in the face of unfounded fear. The witch trials are often cited as one of the earliest examples of mass hysteria in Western history. Fear of the unknown, compounded by the deeply ingrained religious beliefs of the time, created a perfect storm for the persecution of innocent people. Salem, which had once been a small, close-knit community, became a town divided by suspicion and paranoia. Once the trials were underway, fear of being accused became all-consuming. People began accusing one another, often for personal or political gain, and the need for self-preservation outweighed any concern for justice. What made the trials particularly dangerous was that fear, not evidence or reason, became the guiding force in the trials. The accusers were given immense power, and their words were accepted as truth without question. Once someone was accused of witchcraft, their fate was almost sealed. It was not uncommon for entire families to be implicated simply because one member had been accused. Families were torn apart, friendships were destroyed, and once respected members of the community became enemies in the eyes of their neighbors. The trials reflected the mob mentality at work, a psychological phenomenon where the individual sense of responsibility is diluted in a group setting and irrational behaviors become normalized. As more people were accused, more followed suit, and the townspeople's need to preserve their own reputations and avoid suspicion led to an ever-growing number of accusations. The Salem Witch Trials were a clear example of how fear could override reason and how collective hysteria could lead to mass injustice. The trials also exposed the dangers of religious extremism. Puritanism, with its rigid and often unyielding beliefs, created an environment in which anything that deviated from the norm was viewed as a threat. In Salem, the Puritans' strict religious principles led them to interpret every misfortune, illness, or disagreement as evidence of witchcraft. The trials showed how unchecked religious fervor, when combined with fear and superstition, could lead to devastating consequences. The enduring cultural legacy. The Salem Witch Trials have continued to resonate through history as a symbol of the dangers of unchecked fear and irrational justice. They have been referenced in numerous political and social movements, as well as in literature and the arts. Most notably, Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, written during the McCarthy era in the 1950s, drew direct parallels between the witch hunts of Salem and the political witch hunts of the Red Scare, when individuals were accused of being communists with little to no evidence. The play highlighted the parallels between the two periods, both driven by irrational fear, paranoia, and the need to target the other. The trials have also been a focal point in discussions about gender and the oppression of women. The majority of those accused and executed during the Salem Witch Trials were women, many of whom did not conform to the narrow expectations placed on women in Puritan society. The trials have come to represent the ways in which women have historically been scapegoated, controlled, and punished for behaviors perceived as deviant. In modern feminist discourse, the trials are often cited as an example of the extreme consequences of society that seeks to silence and control women. In contemporary society, the Salem Witch Trials continue to serve as a powerful reminder of the importance of safeguarding against the dangers of mass hysteria, scapegoating, and the collapse of justice in times of fear. In a world still often divided by fear and suspicion, the lessons of Salem are timeless. Part 19, The Legacy of Salem, Modern Reflections and Cultural Memory. The Salem Witch Trials, though centuries old, remain one of the most significant and enduring cultural touchstones in American history. The trials, which cost the lives of 20 innocent people and ruined the lives of countless others, have left a lasting legacy that transcends the boundaries of time and place. The impact of these trials can be seen in the way they have shaped modern understandings of justice, human rights, and the dangers of mass hysteria. The trials as a cautionary tale. The most powerful lesson of the Salem Witch Trials is the profound danger of mass hysteria. In times of fear, societies can easily be led astray, with reason and justice becoming secondary to the emotions of the moment. The witch trials serve as a stark reminder of how quickly people can turn on each other when they are gripped by fear, paranoia, and a sense of righteousness. This lesson has been crucial in shaping the way modern societies view the dangers of collective hysteria and mob mentality. It has become a reference point in discussions about the importance of due process, evidence-based decision-making, and the preservation of civil liberties, even during times of crisis. In the 20th century, during the Red Scare and the McCarthy era, the Salem Witch Trials were frequently referenced as a historical parallel. Arthur Miller's 1953 play, The Crucible, explicitly drew on the Salem Witch Trials to comment on the political witch hunts of the McCarthy period. Just as the Puritans of Salem turned on their own neighbors based on unfounded accusations, so too did Americans during the Red Scare accuse one another of being communists without proper evidence. The play became a landmark work, using the Salem Witch Trials as an allegory for the dangers of political paranoia and the abuse of power in times of fear. Miller's play solidified the cultural memory of Salem as a warning about the dangers of scapegoating, mass hysteria, and the dangers of allowing fear to drive policy and justice. The role of the trials in shaping modern legal thought. Another significant legacy of the Salem Witch Trials is their influence on the development of American legal principles. The trials expose the dangerous consequences of allowing irrational beliefs and fear to dictate legal proceedings. The spectral evidence used during the trials, testimony based on visions of the accused spirit, was a key factor in the wrongful convictions. Spectral evidence, along with coerced confessions, show the need for more rigorous standards in criminal justice. In the wake of the trials, legal scholars and lawmakers began to develop a more rational, evidence-based approach to criminal trials, recognizing that testimony based on supernatural or subjective experiences was not a reliable basis for conviction. The Salem Witch Trials also highlighted the need for protections against self-incrimination and the importance of due process in ensuring a fair trial. The trials have been marked by a complete disregard for these fundamental legal protections. The accused were forced to confess under duress, and their rights to a fair defense were denied. This tragedy led to the eventual inclusion of more robust legal safeguards in American jurisprudence, including the right to a fair trial, the right to remain silent, and the right to be protected from coerced confessions. The trials also contribute to the evolution of constitutional law, particularly the Eighth Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. The physical and psychological abuse suffered by the accused, many of whom were tortured, pressed, or burned alive, was a horrific example of what happens when justice is abandoned in the pursuit of fear-driven goals. The trials underscore the need for a justice system that protects the rights and dignity of the accused, even when they are believed to be guilty of heinous crimes. Gender and social justice. The Salem Witch Trials also hold a significant place in the history of gender justice. Of the 20 people executed during the trials, 14 were women, and the majority of the accused were women as well. The trials have long been recognized as a reflection of the systemic misogyny of the time. Many of the women accused were elderly, poor, or socially marginalized, those who did not fit into the ideal of the submissive, pious Puritan woman. In this way, the trials mirrored the broader social control of women's bodies, lives, and choices, which was a widespread feature of the time. In contemporary feminist discourse, the trials are often cited as an early example of how women have been persecuted for their autonomy and for stepping outside the prescribed boundaries of their social roles. The witch hunts, it is argued, were not just about finding witches, but about controlling women. The very qualities that made these women other, their independence, their age, their poverty, or their refusal to conform, became the basis for accusations of witchcraft. This framing of the trials as a gender injustice continues to resonate with modern discussions of women's rights and the societal forces that seek to limit women's freedoms. The Salem Witch Trials have also been used as a powerful symbol in the fight for social justice. They serve as a reminder of how vulnerable marginalized groups are to the forces of oppression, how easily scapegoats can be made of those who are already at society's edges. The trials have inspired movements for the rights of women, minorities, and other marginalized communities who have been persecuted, blamed, and subjected to violence throughout history. The trials in popular culture and education. The Salem Witch Trials have become a central element of popular culture, serving as both a subject of fascination and a grim warning. The story of Salem is frequently told in literature, film, and television, where it continues to captivate audiences. Movies, documentaries, and books about the trials have explored the human cause of hysteria, the dangers of religious extremism, and the consequences of mob mentality. The trials have become a fixture in cultural memory, reminding us of the fragility of justice in times of fear and uncertainty. In educational settings, the Salem Witch Trials are often taught as part of American history, with a focus on the moral lessons they impart. They are studied as an example of the dangers of superstition and the misuse of power. The trials are also used to discuss the evolution of American legal and social systems, particularly in relation to the rights of the accused, due process, and the importance of safeguarding against the abuse of authority. The story of Salem is presented not just as a historical event, but as a cultural and moral lesson for future generations. As a historical event, the trials have become a cultural mirror, reflecting society's ongoing struggles with justice, fear, and the persecution of vulnerable groups. The lessons of Salem continue to inform discussions about social justice, human rights, and the importance of protecting the innocent from unjust persecution. Part 20, Modern Reflections. The trials in today's context. The Salem Witch Trials, though long in the past, remain an enduring part of the collective memory of the United States. They continue to be a source of cultural reflection, offering valuable lessons for contemporary society. While we may believe that the superstition and fear that led to witch hunts have long since disappeared, the events of Salem still echo in the struggles of modern societies. The lessons of the trials are still relevant today, as they challenge us to reflect on our understanding of justice, fairness, and the vulnerability of individuals in times of social panic. The trials as a mirror to modern mass hysteria. One of the most unsettling lessons from the Salem Witch Trials is the ease with which mass hysteria can consume a society. In a time of uncertainty, when fear takes hold of a community, people can be driven to commit atrocities, believing that they are acting in the name of justice. The witch trials were a manifestation of how fear, whether it was fear of witches, the devil, or the unknown, can lead a society to abandon reason and allow irrational, baseless accusations to dominate. This pattern is not limited to the Salem Witch Trials. History is filled with examples of mass hysteria and panic leading to unjust persecution. The Red Scare of the 1950s, during which many Americans were accused of communism without solid evidence, mirrors the Salem Witch Trials in many ways. Like the accused witches, those targeted by McCarthyism were often innocent, with their lives ruined by a climate of fear and suspicion. Today, we see similar patterns in the way people can be demonized for political, social, or cultural differences, where entire groups can be labeled as enemies of society based on unfounded fears. The trials serve as a reminder that in times of social, political, or economic upheaval, the most vulnerable in society, whether women, minorities, or outsiders, are at the greatest risk of being scapegoated. The Salem Witch Trials illustrate how hysteria can become so widespread that entire communities become complicit in the persecution of their neighbors, even when the evidence for their guilt is flimsy or non-existent. Whether it is a persecution of immigrants in contemporary politics or the marginalization of marginalized groups, the lessons of Salem remind us that societies must remain vigilant against the dangers of fear-driven violence and persecution. The trials and modern legal protections. The trials also serve as an important historical lesson about the development of modern legal protections. In Salem, due process was abandoned and the accused were subjected to cruel interrogations, tortured into confessions, and convicted based on flimsy or fabricated evidence. The lack of a fair trial, the use of spectral evidence, and the disregard for the rights of the accused were glaring examples of the dangers of a legal system dominated by fear and superstition. In the years following the trials, the American legal system evolved to prevent such miscarriages of justice from happening again. The principles of due process, fair trial, and evidence-based decision-making were established as fundamental pillars of the U.S. judicial system. The rights of the accused, protected by the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendments, ensure that individuals cannot be falsely accused and convicted without evidence, and that they have the right to a defense. The presumption of innocence and the right to remain silent, among other protections, arose in response to the failures of Salem's justice system. In modern times, the trials continue to be studied as a cautionary tale about the dangers of abandoning these fundamental protections. In a world where the accused can often be vilified in the media and convicted in the court of public opinion, the lessons of Salem emphasize the importance of safeguarding individuals' legal rights and upholding the integrity of the justice system, even in times of national or social crisis. Feminism in the trials. a continuing struggle for women's rights. The Salem Witch Trials are also a focal point in feminist discourse, illustrating how women have historically been marginalized, controlled, and persecuted. Most of the victims of the trials were women, particularly those who did not fit the expected norms of Puritan society. Many of the accused were independent, outspoken, or socially unconventional women, qualities that were viewed with suspicion by the community. The trials serve as an example of how women's autonomy has been suppressed throughout history. They highlight the ways in which fear of female independence, sexuality, and power has led to the persecution of women. This pattern of controlling women's bodies and lives, often through accusation, fear, and violence, can still be seen today in many parts of the world. Whether in the form of gender-based violence, reproductive rights struggles, or misogynistic legal systems, the Salem Witch Trials continue to remind us of the ongoing fight for women's rights and the protection of women from discrimination and oppression. Feminist scholars continue to study the trials as a part of the broader history of gendered violence. The fact that women were disproportionately accused of witchcraft is not just a coincidence. It reflects the deeply ingrained misogyny of the time. The trials show how easily a society can target women who challenge traditional gender roles, or those who have been made other by their social or economic status. In modern feminist movements, the Salem Witch Trials are often cited as an early and violent example of the ways in which women have been persecuted for their independence. Salem's legacy in popular culture, lessons in storytelling. The Salem Witch Trials have also taken on a significant role in popular culture. Their story continues to captivate audiences and inspire numerous works of fiction, from novels and films to plays and documentaries. The trials have been depicted in countless ways, often as a symbol of the dangers of extremism, paranoia, and unchecked power. The most famous dramatization of the trials remains Arthur Miller's The Crucible, which became a powerful metaphor from the McCarthy era and remains a staple in high school and college curriculums. The play's exploration of the dangers of mass hysteria and the consequences of political witch hunts resonates strongly with modern audiences. The trials have also been explored in films and documentaries, where the historical events are re-examined with a modern understanding of justice and human rights. In recent years, the story of Salem has taken on new layers of meaning as people continue to look at it through contemporary lenses, whether through the hashtag #MeToo movement, discussions of social justice, or growing calls for reparations and accountability for historical wrongs. Salem has become a symbolic space in popular culture, a site where fear and justice collide, and where the tension between superstition and reason is laid bare. It continues to inspire reflection on the nature of fear, the human tendency to persecute the other, and the delicate balance between power and justice. Part 21, Unearthing the Past, the Archaeology of Salem Witch Trials. The Salem Witch Trials have long been shrouded in mystery. Despite the volumes of written records, trial documents, and personal accounts, there are many facets of the witch hunts that remain elusive, particularly regarding the lives of the accused and the broader societal impact of hysteria. While much is known about the trials themselves, the accusations, the confessions, the executions, much of the day-to-day reality of Salem during the trials has remained hidden, buried beneath layers of time, superstition, and the natural decay of history. However, in recent years, archaeological discoveries have begun to shed light on some of these forgotten aspects, offering new insights into how the trials unfolded and what life was like in Salem during that tumultuous period. One of the most significant archaeological discoveries occurred in the early 21st century at Gallows Hill, the location where many of the accused were executed. For centuries, the exact location of the gallows remained a mystery. Early accounts from the trials had described the hill where the executions took place, but over time, the site had been lost to history. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, archaeological teams began to excavate the area around Gallows Hill, hoping to locate evidence that might clarify the location of the hangings and provide further context for the executions. In 2015, a team of archaeologists led by Dr. Mary E.S. McMurray identified a possible site for the gallows, confirming it with the discovery of human remains. The bones, which were likely those of an individual who had been hanged during the trials, provided a tangible connection to the dark past of Salem. These remains were analyzed for signs of trauma, and the findings suggested that they were consistent with those of someone who had been executed by hanging, an important moment in uncovering the physical reality of the witch hunts. The discovery at Gallows Hill was just the beginning of the efforts to unearth Salem's past. Archaeologists have also turned their attention to the homes of the accused and the areas where the most dramatic moments of the witch hunt occurred. In 2016, excavation work was conducted near the Salem Village Parsonage, the former home of Reverend Samuel Parris, whose daughter, Betty, and niece, Abigail, were among the first to exhibit strange behavior that led to the witch hunts. Artifacts uncovered in the vicinity included items that likely belonged to the Parris family, offering glimpses into the everyday lives of those at the heart of the trials. Beyond the sites of the executions and the homes of the influential figures, archaeologists have also turned their focus to the prison cells where the accused were held before trial. The Old Burying Point Cemetery, one of the oldest cemeteries in Salem, has long been a subject of interest for historians and archaeologists alike. Within its grounds lies the grave of George Burroughs, the former Salem minister who was executed despite his desperate plea of innocence. Excavations of Salem's burial grounds have helped uncover clues about burial practices during the trials and the lives of those who lived and died during this dark period. Archaeologists have also found evidence of unmarked graves near some of the executed witches, suggesting that their deaths, often executed without ceremony or recognition, were followed by a complete erasure from the town's memory. The discovery of these forgotten graves speaks to the cruelty of the trials and the ultimate marginalization of those who were persecuted. Unearthed artifacts, items such as coins, personal belongings, and fragments of clothing, help tell the story of daily life during the trials. These items offer a glimpse into the world of the accusers and the accused alike. Some of the objects found at execution sites and within the homes of those accused of witchcraft suggest that the accused had little chance of preparing themselves for the horror that awaited them. Books, religious texts, and personal letters found during excavations help to create a more comprehensive picture of the emotional and psychological impact the witch trials had on the community. While these archaeological finds cannot change the past, they have helped to humanize the victims of the trials. The bones of the executed, the remains of homes, the relics of daily life. These discoveries tell a story that goes beyond the trial transcripts, beyond the pages of history. They help us understand the suffering of the innocent, the pain of those who were falsely accused, and the fear and paranoia that defined Salem during the witch hunts. Part 22, Memorialization and Modern Reflections. As the centuries have passed since the Salem Witch Trials, the town of Salem has been transformed from a place marked by shame and fear to one of reflection, education, and remembrance. The trials, which once caused irreparable divisions in the community, have now become a key aspect of Salem's identity and cultural heritage. This shift from a dark chapter in history to a more reflective, educational space has been central to understanding the broader implications of the trials and how they resonate in modern times. The memorialization of the trials. The Salem Witch Trials Memorial, established in 1992, is one of the most significant efforts to memorialize the events of 1692 and recognize the lives lost during the trials. The memorial was built on the site of Gallows Hill, where many of the accused were executed. The monument consists of 20 granite stones, each engraved with the names of the men and women who were executed. The memorial serves as a public acknowledgement of the injustice and the devastating consequences of the witch hunt, allowing visitors to connect with the history on a personal level. The design of the memorial is simple yet powerful. The stones are arranged in a circle, symbolizing the unity and collective loss experienced by the families of the accused. Each stone bears the name of an individual who was executed, along with the date of their death. The space is quiet, contemplative, and open, inviting visitors to reflect on the human cost of the trials and the legacy of fear that they left behind. The Salem Witch Trials Memorial is not just a tribute to victims. It is also a reminder of the need to reflect on the cultural forces that allow such injustices to occur. The trials were fueled by fear, paranoia, and religious extremism, forces that continue to exist in modern society. The memorial, then, serves as both an educational tool and a call to action, urging people to confront the ways in which fear can drive people to commit cruel acts in the name of righteousness. In addition to memorial, the town of Salem has preserved several key sites associated with the trials, including the Witch House, which was the home of Judge Jonathan Corwin, one of the judges involved in the trials. The house is now a museum, offering visitors a glimpse into the life of one of the key figures in the trials. Here, visitors can learn about the role Corwin played in the event, as well as gain insight into the broader social and political context of the time. The town also maintains the old Burying Point Cemetery, the final resting place of several of the accused, including John Proctor, Rebecca Nurse, and Elizabeth Proctor. These graves have become a focal point for visitors, allowing people to pay their respects and reflect on the injustices of the trials. Over time, the cemetery has become a symbol of the tragic and irreversible damage caused by the trials. Modern reflections and cultural impact. The Salem Witch Trials continue to be a major point of reference in modern discussions about social justice, due process, and human rights. The trials, particularly the way the accused were treated, are frequently cited as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power, mass hysteria, and the abuse of the legal system. In contemporary feminist discourse, the Salem Witch Trials are often examined through a gendered lens. The trials predominantly targeted women, many of whom were marginalized in society for reasons such as age, social status, or perceived deviance from accepted gender roles. The persecution of women in the trials has been interpreted as an example of the patriarchal control that has historically been exerted over women's bodies, actions, and autonomy. The trials are seen as a reflection of the ways in which society has used fear and superstition to control women, particularly those who do not conform to the norms of their time. The Salem Witch Trials also speak to broader issues of scapegoating and social exclusion. In times of social crisis, marginalized groups, whether based on gender, race, or economic status, are often blamed for societal ills, leading to a cycle of persecution. The Salem Witch Trials are emblematic of this pattern, where the vulnerable and powerless were targeted by the more powerful, and fear became a tool of social control. The modern-day struggles of marginalized groups, from racial minorities to immigrant populations, echo the same fears that fueled the witch hunts in Salem. In popular culture, the Salem Witch Trials have been immortalized in literature, film, and theater. Arthur Miller's The Crucible, written in 1953, continues to be one of the most influential works about the trials, using them as an allegory for the Red Scare and the McCarthy hearings. The play has been performed worldwide, providing a critical reflection on the dangers of mass paranoia and the ways in which people can be manipulated by fear. The ongoing relevance of the play speaks to the cultural power of the Salem Witch Trials as a metaphor for any era in which fear and suspicion dominate. The trials have also been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and films that continue to reflect on the social, legal, and emotional costs of the events. These works aim to educate the public about the horrors of the witch hunts and to ensure that the lessons of Salem are not forgotten. The trials are an enduring symbol of the human tendency to sacrifice justice and reason in pursuit of fear-driven righteousness, a lesson that remains highly relevant in modern times. The role of the trials in modern legal and political thought. The Salem Witch Trials are often referenced in legal and political discussions, particularly in the context of civil rights and human dignity. The trials expose the dangers of a legal system that allowed fear to override reason, where accused individuals had no chance to defend themselves and were often convicted based on nothing more than hearsay and superstition. The lack of due process, the use of spectral evidence, and the disregard for the rights of the accused were clear violations of basic human rights. The trials also serve as a cautionary tale about the abuse of power by authorities. The role of religious leaders and judges in driving the witch hunts has been the subject of intense scrutiny, as it reveals how easily those in power can manipulate the legal system to enforce their own beliefs and agendas. In modern times, the Salem Witch Trials have been referenced in debates about government overreach and the importance of protecting civil liberties, especially during times of political or social unrest. Part 23. Unanswered Questions: The Lasting Mysteries of Salem. While archaeological efforts and modern scholarship have uncovered much about the Salem Witch Trials, numerous questions remain unresolved, adding an element of intrigue and mystery to this dark chapter of history. The trials were so entrenched in superstition and paranoia that even today, historians, archaeologists, and scholars are still working to uncover the full truth about the events that transpired in 1692. From hidden artifacts to the lingering cultural effects, the mysteries of Salem continue to captivate the imagination and spur new avenues of research. The missing pieces, archaeological discoveries, and lost evidence. Though archaeological efforts have shed light on key aspects of the trials, many elements of the trials remain veiled in uncertainty. For example, the exact location of Gallows Hill, where the executions took place, was a subject of speculation for centuries. While modern excavations have provided strong evidence of the area's historical significance, there are still gaps in our knowledge about the specifics of the executions. Though we know that 20 people were executed, there's no clear record of how many may have been executed outside the public eye, or of how many were buried in unmarked graves. There are questions surrounding the methods of execution used in Salem as well. While hanging is the most widely known method, the use of pressing, as in the case of Giles Corey, and burning remains unclear in some instances, leaving a lingering sense of mystery about how justice was carried out during this horrific time. In addition, there are still questions about how much involvement Salem's leaders, including Reverend Samuel Parris and the judges like Judge Samuel Sewell, had in stoking the flames of fear. It is well documented that the trials were based on speculation and public hysteria, but many of the documents detailing the role of influential figures have either been lost to time or buried in archives that are yet to be fully examined. Did these key figures manipulate public sentiment for their own political or personal gain? Or were they simply swept along by the feverish belief in the supernatural? This lingering ambiguity about the true motives of key players in the trials continues to puzzle researchers. The role of confession and torture, unveiling the pressure to confess. One of the most significant aspects of the trials that remains unclear is the full scope of the pressure that led to the false confessions of many accused individuals. While we know that the accused were tortured and coerced into confessing, the specific methods used in the trials are still debated. Some sources mention the use of sleep deprivation, physical restraints, and threats of execution to force confessions from those accused of witchcraft. In particular, the use of the touch test, where the accused was made to touch the afflicted individuals, with a claim that this would stop their symptoms, remains an unsettling mystery. How did this bizarre practice evolve, and how widespread was it during the trials? More disturbing still are the confessions made under duress. Many of the accused, particularly the most vulnerable, such as women, the elderly, and the poor, admitted to witchcraft, naming others in the process, in the hopes of avoiding execution. However, the impact of these coerced confessions continues to raise questions. What psychological toll did these confessions take on the individuals who made them, and how did they affect the entire community? The social and emotional aftermath of these confessions, which likely ruined the lives of both the accusers and the accused, remains largely unexplored. The legacy of spectral evidence, unraveling the power of the supernatural. Perhaps one of the most puzzling elements of the trials is the use of spectral evidence, which has never been fully understood. Spectral evidence was based on the testimony of the accusers, who claimed to have seen the spirits of the accused tormenting them. This form of evidence was accepted by the courts as proof of witchcraft, even though it was completely unsubstantiated. How did spectral evidence become so widely accepted, even by religious and legal authorities? And why was it used as a basis for so many convictions? Some historians have suggested that the widespread belief in the supernatural, coupled with the intense religious fervor of the Puritan community, made spectral evidence seem plausible at the time. Others argue that spectral evidence was simply a convenient tool for those seeking to maintain control over a rapidly unraveling society. Whatever the reason, it remains one of the most perplexing aspects of the trials, and the impact of such a dangerous precedent has lasted for centuries. In modern legal systems, circumstantial or unverifiable evidence is strictly prohibited. Yet in Salem, the courts accepted visions of ghosts and spirits as legitimate proof, leading to the deaths of many innocent people. The social and psychological effects on Salem survivors. While much attention has been paid to the lives of the accused, there is less exploration of the long-term psychological effects on those who survived the trials. How did those who were falsely accused but not executed recover from the emotional trauma of being publicly accused of witchcraft? How did the community as a whole process the collective guilt of having participated in such a horrifying episode of injustice? The emotional and psychological scars left by the trials are still felt today, even by the descendants of those involved. Family dynamics were irreparably altered, as some accused individuals were forced to turn on loved ones in an effort to save themselves. Even for those who survived, the public disgrace and loss of reputation never fully healed. The The families of the executed were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, and some never fully recovered from the emotional toll of the trials. The collective trauma of Salem also had a ripple effect on the broader Puritan society, which had to grapple with the moral questions raised by the events. How could a community, once grounded in faith and trust, have fallen prey to such a terrifying wave of paranoia? And why, in such a tightly controlled society, did the trials gain such momentum, claiming the lives of so many innocent people? The enduring mystique of Salem, uncovering the hidden truths. While modern research and archaeology have provided valuable insights into the trials, many aspects of the Salem Witch Trials remain shrouded in mystery. The complex interplay of fear, religious zealotry, and personal ambition that led to witch hunts is still difficult to fully comprehend. Archaeological finds, written documents, and first-hand accounts provide a fragmented picture of the events, but much remains elusive. The true motivations behind the witch hunts, the complete role of the influential figures involved, and the full emotional toll on survivors are still largely unknown. These unanswered questions continue to fuel the mystique of the Salem Witch Trials, ensuring that the story of Salem remains one of the most captivating and unsettling chapters in American history. Part 24. The Trials as a Cultural and Political Metaphor. The Salem Witch Trials, despite their dark historical context, have evolved into a powerful cultural and political metaphor. In the centuries following the events of 1692, the trials have been revisited time and again, not just as a tragic episode in American history, but as a reflection of the dangers of fear-driven justice, mass hysteria, and the abuse of power. From McCarthyism in the 1950s to modern political witch hunts, the Salem Witch Trials continue to serve as a stark reminder of the consequences of irrationality, scapegoating, and the erosion of due process. Salem as a symbol of fear and persecution. The trials have long been interpreted as a symbol of how quickly fear can override reason and how easily a society can be manipulated by those in power. The trials were driven by fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of the devil. Fear of what lay outside the tightly controlled Puritan community. It was a fear that spread quickly, like wildfire, infecting everyone in its path, and it led to a breakdown of social trust. The witch hunts revealed how easily fear could be used as a tool of social control, leading to accusations, imprisonment, and even execution based on little more than superstition. In the modern era, the story of Salem has often been invoked to warn against the dangers of unchecked authority and the criminalization of fear. The idea of witch hunts continues to permeate contemporary political discourse, especially in moments of heightened anxiety or national crisis. The metaphor of a witch hunt is frequently used to describe political persecutions that seek to destroy an individual's reputation or career without evidence, often based on rumors or unfounded accusations. Perhaps one of the most poignant examples of the Salem Witch Trials as a cultural metaphor came during the McCarthy era of the 1950s. The Red Scare, led by Senator Joseph McCarthy, was a period in which American citizens were accused of being communist or communist sympathizers, often based on flimsy evidence or hearsay. Just as in Salem, individuals were publicly shamed, blacklisted, and ostracized from society. Many lost their jobs, livelihoods, and reputations, while others faced prison sentences. The parallels between the Salem Witch Trials and the McCarthy hearings were stark. Both involved the persecution of individuals based on fear, paranoia, and an unshakable belief in the righteousness of the accusers. Both events were driven by a desire to root out perceived evil, regardless of the cost. Witch hunts in modern politics and society. In the 21st century, the metaphor of the witch hunt is still used frequently in political and social discourse. Whether it's accusations of fake news or the use of social media to target individuals, the methods of witch hunting may have evolved, but the core elements remain the same. Public shaming, mob mentality, and the destruction of lives based on unsubstantiated claims continue to haunt modern societies. In political witch hunts today, accusations are often made with the intent to damage reputations and destroy careers. Whether it's in the media or on social platforms, individuals are sometimes convicted in the court of public opinion, without due process or evidence, echoing the process seen in Salem. Social media platforms have become the new trial grounds, where accusations spread like wildfire and the consequences of being labeled as guilty can be immediate and irreversible. Just as the accusations of witchcraft in Salem were often based on personal vendettas, modern political witch hunts frequently reflect the same dynamics, where public figures or private citizens are targeted by rivals or political opponents. The enduring feminist lens. The Salem Witch Trials have become a powerful symbol in the feminist movement, serving as a stark reminder of the ways in which gender plays a critical role in societal oppression. In a world where women have historically been marginalized, the Salem Witch Trials are a reminder of the immense dangers that women have faced when they deviate from societal norms. The vast majority of those accused, convicted, and executed were women, many of whom did not fit the idealized roles of the submissive, domestic woman in Puritan society. Women who were outspoken, independent, or socially marginalized were seen as threats to the patriarchal order, and it was often these women who were most likely to be accused of witchcraft. The feminist discourse surrounding the trials highlights how misogyny shaped the accusations and trials. Women like Tituba, Sarah Good, and Rebecca Nurse were not only accused of witchcraft, but were also accused of acting outside the boundaries of acceptable femininity. Tituba, an enslaved woman, was seen as an outsider because of her cultural background. Sarah Good was a poor beggar who didn't conform to the expected social role of woman, and Rebecca Nurse, despite her respected position in society, was accused due to her questioning of the trials. These women were targeted because they did not conform to the rigid expectations placed on women by the patriarchal society of Salem. In modern feminist thought, the trials are often used as an example of how fear of women's power and fear of women's independence can lead to their persecution. The trials serve as an early example of how women have been blamed for societal problems and then silenced, marginalized, or punished as a result. Today, the feminist analysis of the trials continues to inform conversations about gender violence, the control of women's bodies, and the ongoing fight for women's rights, the witch hunts and social justice movements. In addition to their role in feminist discourse, the Salem Witch Trials have also become emblematic of social justice movements more broadly. The trials remind us of the dangers of scapegoating, where an entire group of people can be blamed for societal ills and persecuted as a result. Minorities, immigrants, LGBTQ+ communities, and other marginalized groups have often been targets of persecution throughout history, much like the women in Salem. The idea of witch hunt is used to describe modern hate crimes, racial profiling, and xenophobia, where a minority group is unfairly singled out, demonized, and targeted. In the 21st century, the Salem Witch Trials have come to symbolize social injustice and the danger of allowing fear and prejudice to dictate laws and social practices. Whether in the form of racial discrimination, religious persecution, or political targeting, the lessons of Salem continue to resonate. The witch hunts serve as a reminder that, in times of fear, it is essential to be vigilant against the forces that seek to scapegoat and oppress vulnerable communities. Part 25, Ethics of Memory, the struggle to remember Salem. The Salem Witch Trials, once a story of shame and disgrace of the town of Salem, have transformed into an important part of the American historical consciousness. But the process of memorializing such a dark chapter in history comes with complex ethical questions. How do we remember the victims and the accused? How do we ensure that this history is taught in a way that prevents future injustices from occurring? What responsibility do we have to preserve the memory of the trials? And how should it be presented to the public? In the years since the trials, Salem has made a concerted effort to come to terms with its past. The town has become a focal point of historical tourism and education, drawing thousands of visitors annually who come to learn about the trials and their lasting effects. However, the very act of memorializing the trials presents its own set of ethical dilemmas. Is it possible to honor the memory of those who were wrongfully accused without sensationalizing or trivializing the events? How do we balance a desire for public education with the need to respect the gravity of the tragedies that occurred? The memorialization debate. The construction of the Salem Witch Trials Memorial in 1992 marked a pivotal moment in the town's reckoning with its past. The memorial was designed to honor the 20 individuals who were executed during the trials, and it serves as a space for reflection. However, the memorial itself is not without controversy. Some critics argue that it does not fully capture the scale of the trials and the broader suffering caused by the hysteria. For example, while the memorial features the names of the executed, It does not provide significant context about the emotional toll of the trials on the accused who were not executed, or the long-lasting effects on the community as a whole. The memorial focuses primarily on the execution victims, but leaves out the broader context of how families were torn apart, how property was confiscated, and how the trials led to enduring psychological trauma. Some historians and members of the community argue that Salem, as a modern town, is too focused on tourism and sensationalism when it comes to the witch trials. While the Salem Witch Trials Memorial is a significant step toward acknowledgement and education, it's impossible to ignore the commercialization of the witch trials in popular culture. Witch-themed shops, haunted tours, and festivals abound, leading some to question whether the real pain and gravity of the trials are being lost in the quest for profit and entertainment. The ethics of memorialization, then, are bound up in a careful balance between educating the public and not reducing the tragedy to spectacle. Reconciliation and responsibility. Beyond the physical memorials, the Salem Witch Trials have also prompted public and private efforts to seek some form of reconciliation for the descendants of those wronged by the trials. The state of Massachusetts issued formal apologies in the 20th century, and some individuals and organizations have called for greater reparations or recognition of the wrongs done to the families who lost loved ones or suffered public disgrace. However, the complexity of reparations for such an event is fraught with challenges. How do you compensate for the lives lost to an unjust legal system? How do you make amends for the psychological trauma inflicted on those falsely accused? While direct reparations are difficult, there have been movements to offer symbolic acts of atonement. For instance, the descendants of the accused have been recognized through events that honor their memory. Some families who trace their lineage back to the victims of the witch trials have made public statements of forgiveness or healing, acknowledging the profound impact of the trials while embracing a spirit of reconciliation. These efforts to reconcile the past are deeply personal and symbolic, representing a broader desire to heal the historical wounds caused by the trials. Salem as a site of ethical reflection. The Salem Witch Trials have become more than just a historical event. They have become a space for ethical reflection on the nature of justice, fear, and human rights. The town of Salem, through its museums, memorials, and public education efforts, now serves as a place of moral reckoning. The trials continue to provide a space where we can reflect on the dangers of mass hysteria, how easily fear can corrupt reason, and the importance of protecting the rights of the vulnerable. One of the primary ethical questions raised by the trials is how do we ensure such an atrocity never happens again? While we may believe that the Salem Witch Trials are a relic of a bygone era, there are modern parallels that demonstrate how fear and superstition can still wreak havoc in society. From political witch hunts and religious persecution to the targeting of marginalized communities during times of crisis, the lessons of Salem remain highly relevant. In fact, modern social justice movements often cite the Salem Witch Trials as a reference point when discussing the dangers of scapegoating, public shaming, and the loss of due process. The trials also raise the ethical question of how we treat individuals who are accused of crimes in times of crisis. In the trials, many of the accused were forced to confess to crimes they did not commit in order to avoid execution. The treatment of these individuals, who were tortured, publicly humiliated, and condemned without evidence, remains one of the most troubling aspects of the trials. In modern society, the protection of the accused's rights remains a critical pillar of legal systems, and the Salem Witch Trials serve as a reminder how easily these protections can be undermined when fear and panic dominate. The enduring importance of teaching Salem's history. The importance of teaching the history of the Salem Witch Trials has only grown in modern society. The trials offer valuable lessons about the dangers of mass hysteria, the abuse of power, and the violation of human rights. These lessons are as important today as they were in the past, especially as society faces new challenges related to fear-driven persecution, political corruption, and the erosion of civil liberties. Educators, historians, and activists continue to draw from the story of Salem as a means of teaching young people about justice, fairness, and the importance of standing up for the rights of others. In a world where division, fear, and suspicion still shape social and political dynamics, the Salem Witch Trials remind us of the need to protect those who are vulnerable, to preserve due process, and to ensure that our justice systems remain fair, even in times of crisis. Part 26. The Trials in Modern Justice. Lessons in Civil Liberties and Legal Protections. The Salem Witch Trials stand as one of the most horrifying episodes of injustice in early American history. While the trials have been memorialized and analyzed through historical, social, and cultural lenses, they also provide enduring lessons for modern justice systems. In particular, the trials offer a stark reminder of the fragility of civil liberties and the ease with which a society can devolve into the persecution of innocent individuals under the pressure of fear, mass hysteria, and social control. The importance of due process and fair trials. One of the most profound lessons that the Salem Witch Trials offer modern society is the importance of due process and the protection of individual rights. In Salem, the justice system was turned upside down as people were convicted and executed based on unreliable evidence like spectral testimony, hearsay, and coerced confessions. Spectral evidence, where accusers claimed to have seen the spirits of the accused causing harm, became central to many of the trials. This form of evidence was not verifiable and was based solely on subjective claims that could not be substantiated. The presence of spectral evidence in the trials illustrates how easily a legal system can be manipulated by fear and superstition, leading to the wrongful conviction of innocent individuals. The Salem trials expose the danger of allowing emotion and fear to cloud legal proceedings. The lack of tangible evidence, coupled with the societal hysteria, allowed the judicial system to abandon basic protections that are central to modern legal systems. Accused individuals had no right to a defense, no protection from coerced confessions, and were guilty until proven innocent, an inversion of the principles that form the foundation of modern justice. The presumption of innocence and the right to a fair trial are now cornerstones of legal systems in democratic societies. The Salem Witch Trials illustrate how these protections can be swept aside when fear and irrationality take control. In today's world, where accusations, particularly those spread through social media, can destroy lives with little evidence, the lessons of Salem serve as a timely reminder of why due process and evidence-based trials are essential for ensuring justice. The role of fear in justice. Salem also teaches us about the dangers of fear-driven justice. The witch hunts were propelled by the collective fear of the devil, witches, and the supernatural, but that same fear also drove the persecution of people who were deemed other. Fear allowed the authorities to rationalize the persecution of vulnerable individuals, women, the poor, and those who were not in power. Modern examples of scapegoating and targeting marginalized communities can still be seen in how fear continues to drive the persecution of racial minorities, immigrants, and LGBTQ+ individuals. The othering of people based on fear and the desire to maintain societal control is still alive in today's world, reminding us that social and legal systems must remain vigilant against the dangerous forces of fear and prejudice. In contemporary society, moral panics, such as the war on drugs, anti-immigrant sentiment, or terrorism fears, continue to target vulnerable populations. These modern-day witch hunts often rely on fear-based narratives and stereotype-driven accusations, similar to how the Puritans viewed those who were accused of witchcraft. Just as in Salem, when societies are gripped by mass panic, individuals can become vilified based on irrational fears, leading to wrongful accusations and even violence. The lessons of Salem continue to be relevant today as we confront the ways in which fear can lead to the erosion of civil liberties and the undermining of justice. The role of modern media in amplifying fear. Today, the media plays a significant role in amplifying fear and shaping public opinion. The Salem Witch Trials demonstrate how easily public perception can be manipulated by sensationalism and fear-mongering. In the 17th century, the witch trials were propagated by oral testimony, rumors, and religious propaganda. In the modern world, these tactics are still alive in the form of 24-hour news cycles, social media, and political rhetoric that often prey on the fears of the public. Much like the spectral evidence used to convict individuals in Salem, modern media can perpetuate narratives that demonize and scapegoat certain groups. This creates a vicious cycle where fear becomes a driving force behind public opinion, much as it was during the witch trials. Media outlets, particularly social media, can accelerate the spread of rumors, turning accusations into mob justice. People are often tried and convicted in the court of public opinion long before they ever step into a formal courtroom. These media-driven witch hunts often lack solid evidence, relying instead on sensational headlines, inflammatory language, and emotionally charged imagery to sway the public. This dynamic parallels the way fear and superstition led to the wrongful convictions of innocent people during the Salem Witch Trials. Salem as a lesson in the importance of education. One of the most important contributions to the modern understanding of the Salem Witch Trials is education. By studying the trials and the factors that allowed them to happen, modern societies can better understand the dangers of social divisions, prejudice, and fear-driven justice. Teaching about Salem's history is not just about remembering the past. It's about using that memory to shape a better future. Educational programs, documentaries, and historical sites dedicated to the trials aim to help people recognize the warning signs of injustice before it's too late. Salem's story also teaches us about the power of historical memory. The town of Salem has worked hard to transform its tragic past into an opportunity for reflection, teaching, and growth. The establishment of museums, memorials, and historical sites serves not only to honor the victims of the trials, but also to help contemporary society understand how fear and paranoia can lead to the destruction of individual rights. In modern discussions of human rights and civil liberties, the Salem Witch Trials offer a historical example of what can happen when due process is ignored and fear-based accusations are allowed to govern societal actions. The lessons of Salem are not just academic. They are moral, ethical, and legal reminders that are just as important today as they were in 1692. Part 27, Salem and the Academy, Scholarly Analysis and Modern Perspectives. The Salem Witch Trials have been a focal point for historians, sociologists, and scholars of law for centuries, and they remain a critical area of study today. The trials have generated a vast body of scholarship that has shaped our understanding of early American history, Puritan society, and the cultural forces that drive mass hysteria and persecution. Modern scholarship continues to analyze the trials from a variety of perspectives, looking at how they unfolded, why they occurred, and what their legacy means in a contemporary context. The trials as a case study in legal and social history. Historians and legal scholars have long used the Salem Witch Trials as a case study in criminal justice, legal procedure, and the flaws in early legal systems. The trials expose the dangers of relying on unreliable evidence and subjective testimony in the justice system. In particular, the use of spectral evidence, the idea that the spirit or specter of the accused could harm others, has been critically analyzed for its lack of concrete, tangible evidence. Legal scholars often point to this as an example of how the justice system can fail when it accepts unverifiable testimony or allows fear and superstition to cloud reason. In studying Salem's legal proceedings, modern scholars have explored the role of the clergy in guiding legal decisions, as well as the way religious and legal authorities work together to enforce moral and social order. Reverend Samuel Parris and others used the legal system to advance their own beliefs, often disregarding fairness and justice in favor of zealotry. The trials, in this sense, demonstrate how religious extremism and the misuse of judicial power can lead to systemic abuse, where individuals become tools for the collective anxieties of the community rather than participants in a fair legal process. Social and psychological analysis of mass hysteria. Sociologists and psychologists have turned to the Salem Witch Trials as a lens through which to study the phenomenon of mass hysteria. The term itself was coined in the wake of Salem to describe the way collective fear can overwhelm a community and lead to irrational actions. The way the trials escalated from a small group of accusations to a town-wide panic is a textbook example of how groupthink, social pressure, and fear-based behavior can take on a life of its own. Many sociologists view the trials as an example of social contagion, where fear spreads among individuals like a virus, growing larger and more powerful with each new accusation. Theories of mob mentality also come into play, as entire communities were swept up in the panic. In Salem, neighbors turn on neighbors, children turn on their parents, and even long-standing friendships were destroyed by the accusations. Scholars have studied how group dynamics influence individual behavior, particularly how collective fear can be used to manipulate entire societies. In psychological terms, the behavior of the afflicted girls, those who began the accusations, has been analyzed in light of modern theories of conversion disorder and mass sociogenic illness. The girls' strange fits, screaming, and convulsions could be seen as symptoms of psychological stress, exacerbated by the intense religious and cultural pressures of their time. Whether these symptoms were purely psychosomatic or influenced by social forces, they became the catalyst of the entire witch hunt. Some scholars have theorized that the girls' behavior was a form of rebellion or attention-seeking in a society that often suppressed women's voices and autonomy. Feminist scholarship and gender analysis. The Salem Witch Trials have been heavily analyzed through a feminist lens, and they are often cited as a stark example of misogyny and gender-based violence. Feminist historians have pointed out that the majority of those accused, convicted, and executed were women, often those who were older, poor, or socially marginalized. The persecution of women, especially women who defied social expectations, is a central theme in feminist analyses of the trials. The trials targeted women who were seen as other in Puritan society, those who did not fit the rigid, religiously defined role of the submissive, virtuous woman. Tituba, an enslaved woman of African descent, was one of the first accused, making her a convenient scapegoat for the community's fears. Sarah Good, another early victim, was a poor beggar, and Sarah Osborne, an older, remarried woman, was also accused due to her perceived deviance from the Puritan ideal of womanhood. Feminist scholars have also examined the power dynamics of the trials, focusing on how women's bodies and autonomy were controlled, policed, and punished. The trials offer a window into the patriarchal structures of the time and demonstrate how the fear of women's power, independence, or sexual agency could result in violence and persecution. The idea of witchcraft became a tool to control women who were seen as dangerous because they did not conform to the idealized, subservient roles that society had assigned to them. The trials, in this light, are an early example of how women's independence was viewed as a threat and how fear of that threat led to brutal consequences. Salem's influence on legal reforms. The trials also played a crucial role in shaping American legal reforms in the 18th and 19th centuries. The wrongful convictions, the use of spectral evidence, and the lack of a fair trial were all critical issues that brought attention to the importance of legal due process and evidence-based justice. As a result, many of the lessons learned from the Salem Witch Trials contributed to the eventual development of the American legal system, which prioritized individual rights, the presumption of innocence, and protection of the accused. The Salem Witch Trials influenced the establishment of clearer legal standards in the United States, including the necessity for physical evidence to convict someone of a crime, the use of circumstantial evidence, which had played a key role in the trials, became increasingly scrutinized in favor of concrete proof. Furthermore, the Salem Witch Trials contributed to the establishment of laws against torture and the prohibition of coerced confessions in criminal trials. Part 28, Political Activism and Human Rights. Salem as a model for modern justice. The Salem Witch Trials, though centuries old, continue to resonate in modern political and social movements. The trials, which led to the wrongful persecution of many innocent individuals based on fear, superstition, and mass hysteria, serve as a powerful cautionary tale about the consequences of abandoning due process, civil liberties, and the protection of human rights. In contemporary times, the trials are often invoked in human rights activism, gender justice movements, and campaigns for political reform. Salem as a symbol of political persecution. Throughout history, the Salem Witch Trials have been used as a symbol of political persecution. When governments or groups wield power over individuals based on fear and suspicion, the consequences can be catastrophic. This is particularly evident in the Red Scare of the 1950s, during which Senator Joseph McCarthy led a campaign to accuse individuals of being communist sympathizers without solid evidence, much like the baseless accusations of witchcraft in Salem. Miller's play The Crucible draws a direct parallel between the witch hunts of Salem and the McCarthy hearings, highlighting how mass hysteria and fear-driven politics can lead to the wrongful persecution of innocent people. Modern political movements, especially those focusing on civil rights, freedom of speech, and government accountability, often reference the Salem Witch Trials when advocating for legal reforms and protections against political witch hunts. In societies where freedom of expression and political dissent are seen as threats, the trials remind us of the vulnerability of political minorities. In particular, political movements aimed at protecting freedom of speech and preventing authoritarianism often draw lessons from the way Salem's judicial system was manipulated by fear and religious zealotry. The witch hunt metaphor is frequently used to highlight injustice in modern political and social contexts. From accusations of terrorism or extremism to the criminalization of activism in authoritarian regimes, the Salem Witch Trials offer a historical lens through which to understand the abuse of power and the erosion of justice in times of crisis. The trials remind us that individuals can be scapegoated for political gain, and that societies must remain vigilant to prevent the criminalization of dissent and the manipulation of fear for political purposes. Gender justice and the ongoing fight for women's rights. In feminist discourse, the Salem Witch Trials have become a powerful symbol of gender-based violence and the marginalization of women. The overwhelming majority of those accused and executed during the witch hunts were women, and many of them were targeted because they did not fit the rigid gender roles prescribed by the Puritan community. Women who were poor, elderly, or socially marginalized were particularly vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft. The trials reflect the ways in which women, particularly those who were seen as deviant or nonconformist, have historically been persecuted for their independence and autonomy. The trials serve as an early example of how gender norms and societal expectations can be used to control women. Women were accused of witchcraft for behaviors as simple as speaking out, refusing to marry, or not conforming to social expectations. The marginalization of women, particularly those who were seen as a threat to the patriarchal order, was a key factor in why they were accused and executed during the trials. In modern gender justice movements, the Salem Witch Trials are often used as an illustration of the patriarchal structures that seek to control women's bodies and suppress their autonomy. Women who are outspoken, politically active, or defy traditional gender roles are still often demonized and marginalized in contemporary society. The trials serve as a reminder of how easily society can target women who challenge traditional norms, and they continue to influence feminist thought today. The feminist perspective on the Salem Witch Trials also emphasizes the intersectionality of the persecution. While the majority of the accused were women, many of the trials also targeted marginalized groups, such as enslaved women like Tituba, whose status as a non-European, non-Christian woman made her an easy scapegoat. The trials reflect how racial, social, and economic inequality intersect with gender oppression, and how vulnerable women of color and lower social classes have always been disproportionately affected by systems of violence, control, and exclusion. Salem and the modern fight for human rights. The legacy of the Salem Witch Trials also continues to inform human rights activism around the world. The trials are cited in discussions about the protection of individual rights, the freedom from torture, and the right to fair trial. In modern times, countries and organizations that aim to prevent state-sponsored persecution, religious discrimination, and violent repression often look to Salem as a historical example of what happens when fear-driven injustice goes unchecked. The trials show how governments and religious institutions can manipulate fear to control individuals, often leading to mass persecution and the criminalization of innocent people. Human rights advocates often refer to the trials when speaking out against modern-day witch hunts, particularly in regions where women's rights, freedom of religion, and freedom of expression are at risk. The same mechanisms that led to the witch hunts in Salem, fear, hysteria, and the exploitation of the vulnerable, are present in many forms of religious persecution, political repression, and social injustice today. By studying Salem's history, activists are reminded of the importance of protecting civil liberties, due process, and human dignity in the face of mass hysteria. Salem as a global symbol for justice. While the Salem Witch Trials are often remembered in the context of American history, their influence extends far beyond the borders of the United States. The trials have become a global symbol of justice and the importance of protecting human rights in times of fear. From Sri Lanka to Iran, from China to the Middle East, societies that are facing persecution and mass hysteria often look to the example of Salem to understand how easily state power can be abused and how the innocent can be sacrificed in the name of fear. In places where human rights abuses continue to occur, whether in the form of political witch hunts, gender-based violence, or ethnic persecution, the legacy of the Salem Witch Trials serves as a poignant reminder of the cost of intolerance and the need for global cooperation to protect the rights of individuals. The lessons of Salem still resonate, serving as both a cautionary tale and a call to action for social justice advocates everywhere. Part 29. Collective Memory, Teaching Salem's Legacy in the Modern World. The Salem Witch Trials, though horrific, have proven to be a critical focal point in shaping how we view justice, fear, and social accountability today. Their enduring cultural significance is reflected in how the trials are remembered, taught, and reflected upon in both educational settings and popular culture. The narrative of Salem serves as an essential tool for teaching modern societies about the dangers of unchecked power, mob mentality, and the importance of civil liberties. The trials in the classroom. Teaching the history of Salem. One of the most significant aspects of the Salem Witch Trials legacy is their place in modern education. The trials are taught in high school and university history courses as part of the curriculum on early American history and legal history. The lessons drawn from the trials emphasize the importance of due process, legal protections for the accused, and the dangers of mass hysteria. Modern educators approach the subject of the Salem Witch Trials with the intention of using them as a teaching moment about the vulnerability of marginalized individuals and the consequences of allowing fear and prejudice to control society. By examining the trials, students can better understand how religious extremism, social exclusion, and fear-driven behavior can lead to mass injustice. This context allows for critical thinking exercises, where students analyze mob mentality, social control, and the role of the media in modern-day social witch hunts. One crucial aspect that has emerged in educational discourse is the importance of questioning authority. The Salem Witch Trials show that when authority figures, whether they be judges, religious leaders, or even political elites, are not held accountable, they can lead entire communities into dangerous actions. Today, critical pedagogy encourages students to ask how this history is relevant to their own lives, pushing them to understand how public fear can influence political movements and justice systems. The teachings of the Salem Witch Trials also serve as a moral lesson about the need to protect individual rights in times of crisis. The trials remind us that during moments of widespread panic, whether caused by economic instability, political unrest, or national security fears, it is essential to resist the urge to sacrifice civil liberties for the sake of perceived safety. The idea that society must stand by the rule of law, especially in the face of social crises, is a key lesson for today's students and leaders alike. Popular culture in the trials. Salem as a symbol in modern media. The Salem Witch Trials have also had a significant influence on popular culture, where they continue to serve as an iconic example of irrational fear and political persecution. Over the years, Salem has become a metaphor used in novels, films, plays, and television to explore themes of social exclusion, justice, and scapegoating. The trials are often depicted as a reflection of how fear can lead to the destruction of innocent lives, with modern interpretations focusing on the psychological and societal effects of mass hysteria. The play Arthur Miller's The Crucible remains one of the most famous cultural works about the trials. Miller's portrayal of the trials as an allegory for McCarthyism in the 1950s, during which many Americans were accused of being communist sympathizers, continues to resonate in political discussions today. The parallels between the Salem Witch Trials and modern-day witch hunts, whether in the form of political repression, racial profiling, or religious discrimination, serve as a cautionary tale for how easily society can descend into paranoia and injustice. In recent years, there has been a resurgence of interest in the Salem Witch Trials in film and television. Numerous documentaries, historical dramas, and even supernatural-themed shows have drawn inspiration from the trials, often using them as a metaphor for societal fears and the consequences of dehumanizing individuals who are perceived as different. The symbolism of the trials, especially the accusations, trials, and executions, continues to resonate in modern media that explores historical trauma and the ethics of memory. Salem as a catalyst for social justice movements. Beyond the classroom and media, the legacy of the Salem Witch Trials has been deeply influential in social justice movements around the world. Modern advocates for human rights and civil liberties frequently reference the witch trials as a critical historical case study in marginalization and persecution. The trials remind activists and organizers about the vulnerabilities of marginalized communities, whether they are racial minorities, immigrants, LGBTQ+ individuals, or political dissidents. The witch hunts were in many ways a scapegoating exercise where an entire group, often those who were already marginalized, were blamed for society's problems. Social justice movements that focus on gender equality, racial justice, and political freedom often cite the Salem Witch Trials as a powerful example of how unchecked fear and the targeting of others can lead to persecution and injustice. The parallels between the trials and modern racial profiling, hate crimes, and anti-immigrant sentiment show how quickly fear can be weaponized against vulnerable groups. As modern activists fight for reparations, gender equality, and legal reforms. They turn to the trials as a symbol of the dangers of social control and the destruction of due process. The trials also highlight the importance of community solidarity in the face of social divisions. The divisions in Salem were stark. Those who were accused were isolated and excluded, left to suffer alone in the face of growing hysteria. In modern movements for social justice, building community solidarity and resisting the forces that seek to divide society has become a central theme. The unity of marginalized communities and support for the oppressed are seen as key to resisting the forces of fear, hate, and exclusion. Salem's continued importance in human rights education. The Salem Witch Trials also continue to play a crucial role in human rights education. Organizations like the Salem Witch Trials Memorial and Historical Preservation Societies emphasize the trial's relevance for global human rights discussions. When teaching about the history of persecution and violence, Salem's story serves as a foundational case study on how fear can lead to mass injustices, particularly when societies target vulnerable groups based on perceived differences. By teaching the trials, human rights educators highlight the importance of due process, fair trials, and civil liberties, rights that are not always guaranteed in times of crisis. Global human rights campaigns, whether focused on political prisoners, refugees, or religious minorities, draw from the lessons of the trials to emphasize the need for legal protections and the vital importance of justice for the vulnerable.